When you think about what's going on in the New Testament and what we get when Jesus Christ comes on the scene, the story of the political and religious history of Israel starts, obviously, with the presentation in the book of Genesis and the idea of promise and covenant that reaches back to Abraham, in which we have promise, covenant, and election, and we also have certain practices that are going to make the people of Israel unique and which are going to also show up with importance when we get to the New Testament. So we have, on the one hand, if you will, promises that God is going to make a special people out of the seed of Abraham, and that through that seed the world's going to be blessed. That's the Abrahamic covenant, of course. We have the promises coming out of the Abrahamic covenant. We have promises coming out of the Davidic covenant that there is going to be an everlasting dynasty through which God is going to work. And we have promises later on in the history of Israel in the New Covenant that God is going to write the law on the hearts of the people and forgive their sins. So this promise background helps to define the spiritual hope of the people of Israel. And we go all the way back to Genesis for it. We also have, however, not just promises, but we have the creation of a people. These people have a land and they have a law. Moses gives the law, which introduces the Mosaic covenant. That produces a holy people whose lifestyle is distinct and comes with distinct practices. They have a distinct temple that they worship at. And there's only supposed to be one temple where they're supposed to worship. Very much in contrast with much of the rest of the religious environment in which Israel functioned. Most religious institutions of the time had multiple locations for worship. So there was to be one temple. There was to be a special diet related to clean and unclean foods. This also was distinctive. There was to be a special rite of, I'll say this, incorporation, circumcision. Which was to indicate one's association with the covenant people. And then there was a special calendar. The most distinctive feature of which was the Sabbath. That on the seventh day they were to rest and gather together and worship. And this combination of features made the life of Israel distinct. And if one engaged in these practices, they could easily be identified by the time we get to the New Testament as a Jewish person, as a member of Israel, etc. So we've got promises, we've got people, and we've got practices. That mark out the people of God. And this is going to become important to the New Testament. Because when the New Testament moves beyond Israel, begins to reach out to the Gentiles, questions are going to arise about these practices that are rooted in the law that came from Moses. Because of 2,000 years of pretty good public relations on the part of the Christian church, we think about this backwards. We're used to thinking about the fact that the law has been done away with, or at least its fulfillment has been reached in Jesus Christ, and so we don't think about this as a practical and social problem. But when you're coming out of it, when you're moving through a religious tradition that for centuries has practiced certain things, and then you get adjustments, whatever causes them, that raises all kinds of questions. In the New Testament, we will find ourselves in the midst of one of these periods of adjustment. And it's difficult for people. People like their religious traditions. Okay? I don't have to make that point to you. Just look at how people choose music in church, and you will understand it. So people like their religious roots. And so what we get emerging in this period is a tension, if I can say it that way, between law and promise. The law being given, but by the time we get to the new covenant, we know we've been told that there are going to be things done in order to make the law more effective than it's been since Moses gave it. And then we've got these promises that extend blessing not just to Israel, but into all the world. And how's that going to work? In the midst of all this, we have a developing sense of kingship, hope that eventually emerges focused on the Davidic line in one form. Actually, when we come to the New Testament, we've got about 3 or 4 different forms of messianic hope, but the dominant messianic hope was the idea that the Messiah would come through a dynastic line connected to David, which reflects both national ideals. We want David to deliver the nation from the nations. At least in its Jewish expression, that's the way it was often expressed. As well as universalistic ideals, that one day this figure would bring peace to the entire world. And those are also in tension. So we have a tension between law and promise. We have a tension between national and universal hopes tied to the figure to come. Add into all that, by the time we get to the end of the Old Testament, the division that has emerged within the people of God between Israel and Judah, between the 10 tribes and the 2, between the north and the south, and in this case, the south are the good boys. You see an alternate cult, an alternate form of worship established at Bethel and Dan. You've got the captivity of the north as the nations begin to overrun the people in 722 and 721. And you've got prophetic warnings that come from the end of the law that says that if you are unfaithful to this law, going back to the time of Moses, what's going to happen? You tell me. If you're unfaithful to the law, what's going to happen? You're going to be judged. How?
Driven out.
Well, it's not so much that you're driven out of your land as you'll be taken over. Okay? Now, that's important. That's important to the New Testament. Because you've been theologically told in your revelation that if you are no longer working as an independent theocracy and there are nations in your midst, what's wrong? You've been unfaithful. So how are you going to try and fix that problem? Okay? What's the solution to the unfaithfulness?
Repentance.
What? Repentance. Okay, and what's the repentance going to do?
The king back on the throne.
Well, you might put a king back on the throne, but the problem is you got nations in your backyard. See, you guys are thinking way too practically. Okay? What are the first 5 books of the Old Testament about? The law. How are you going to be faithful? You're going to keep the law. Okay, this is not rocket science. Right? You don't need a degree in 3rd level calculus to figure out what's going on here. So if there are nations in your backyard and you've theologically been told that if you lose your theocracy it is because you have been unfaithful to the law, then the way to fix the problem is to become faithful to the law. To repent and become faithful to the law, or wait for God's deliverance. one or the other, and in many minds, those two things will go together. We're going to wait for God's deliverance, and we will become faithful to the law again. So one of the things that I'm saying to you is that in the backdrop, we have the issue of a God-established theocracy, which is what Moses brought with the law. But when that gets overrun by the nations, that's a reflection of unfaithfulness that needs to be dealt with by the people and by its leadership. This will help to explain to you why the nations or the Gentiles are viewed with such ambivalence, if not hostility, by the Jews. Their presence and associations with them are a sign of judgment. Not to mention the cultural pressure of having these nations in your backyard, what it's doing to your distinctive practices, and the pressure on your distinctive practices. Towards the end of this period, we get the new covenant in part because one of the solutions in the promise of dealing with this is that God is going to have to work to change his people. And he's going to have to do it from within. That it's not merely going to be an external restructuring that's required, but an internal restructuring as well. So when Israel is completely overrun, both north and south, first by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians, there is a way of reading that theologically that says to the people, you've been unfaithful. That's why this judgment has come upon you. And then, as my wife likes to say, deal with it. Okay, let me stop there. Questions?
Do you think that is Israel's view still today?
Depends. You've got all kinds of different kinds of Jewish people today taking different views. You've got everything from very secular Jews all the way over to very, very, very Orthodox Jews. This is how the very, very, very Orthodox Jews live. Okay, this is why they take the law so literally. This is why if you fly to Israel from the United States and you happen to have a few Orthodox Jews on the plane, okay, and you can't sleep on the plane, and you're up early in the morning and you'll see a group of Orthodox Jews huddled over the corner of the plane, looking out the window, facing towards Jerusalem, offering prayers. Okay? They're being very Orthodox in their faithful execution of the law. There was a saying in one strand of Rabbinic Judaism that said, if we will keep the Sabbath faithfully just twice, Messiah will come. Okay, that's how literally, if you will, they viewed the need to follow the law. But that's a very thin strand of Judaism today. But it's still there among some groups. Yes?
The idea of all these kind of foreign nations, heathen nations, kind of, I guess, influencing Israel, this is probably why in the New Testament there's such a kind of a frustration and concern about Samaritans and all these other.
Exactly right. Exactly right. That's the main point I'm trying to make.
But nothing, from a missiological standpoint, nothing's changed on God's end for his love for all people, but it's changed on how the community engages the nation.
What's happened is that there are a peculiar set of practices that are associated with being a member of Israel.
Right.
That the cultural encroachment of the nations is challenging, just its mere presence. By the way, this is not unusual, okay? This is a general religious phenomenon that we're talking about, okay? Think about all the discussions that happen in churches today, at least churches that are sensitive to these kinds of things, about the encroachment of our own generalized secular culture on our own religious practices, and you'll have an analogy. This is a universal kind of problem. How do you live out your religious distinctives on the one hand, and the things that you feel you are called to do that mark you out as distinct? After all, what is a holy people but a separated people? They are distinct from everybody else and still operate in the midst of the world and engage in the midst of the world. It's always been a biblical tension. Israel was supposed to be a light to the nations. Okay, and one of the things that God gives Israel a hard time for is failing to be that. But what happened is she turned to some degree inward and became concerned about the pressure that was rotating around their ability to keep the law, in part because of the influence of the nations around them. You're going to see this is a constant problem. And we're actually going to look at texts that express this. That's why you can begin to sense, sometimes this is hard to appreciate in the New Testament. You know, the New Testament spends a lot of time talking about how the new community, which is basically a Reformed Jewish community, is interacting with the nations. In its earliest days, it's basically a Reformed Jewish community. How are we interacting with the nations? And you can see the nervousness about an institution that's trying to combine Jews and Gentiles together. Okay? And this is why.
In light of the law and how it's structured, what do you think was maybe God's more desired response for the Jews rather than this kind of insulary approach? I mean, to be a light to the nations, what was called for them to do?
That is the point of the New Testament, is to work that out. Okay, so I'm not going to answer that now. That's part of what the semester story and the walking through this history is about. But I want you to sense the problem, because, like I say, we tend to come at it backwards. We come at it having seen how the Christian church historically has articulated and solved this problem, and we're the products of that. Okay, what I kind of want to get you to begin to feel and sense is, what is it like to have been in the middle of that transition, and how, in some ways, difficult that would be, given the set of circumstances that you're dealing with. I want you to appreciate the setting of Second Temple Judaism and the pressures that it's under because of what's going on. Yeah, Rob?
Is it appropriate to speak of a Judaism in the Second Temple?
No, and that's one of the things we're going to make clear. Is that we aren't speaking, there isn't just one mindset then as there was now. There are going to be various responses to this cultural reality. You're going to have some people whose solution is, these are the cards we've been dealt, we've got to make the best of the situation and do the best we can to get along with the nations. And if that includes some cultural compromise, no problem. Okay? That group is going to end up expressing itself as the Sadducees. Then you're going to have different kinds of separatism that are going to argue, no, we're called to be distinct. And one group is going to say, yeah, we're going to be so distinct, we're going to move out to the desert and live in our own world. Okay? That's the Qumran community and the Essenes. Another group says we're going to be distinct, but we're not going to withdraw. That's going to be your Pharisees. You're going to have another group that says the solution to this is strictly political. We need to throw the bums out. Okay? We need to get the nations out of here. That's going to be your zealots. Other people will say, no, Rome's pretty powerful. We can't beat them with our pop guns, so we're going to have to figure out a different way to do this. We're going to try and cooperate with the leadership that they give us and just plead with them to do the best they can, to be kind to us as much as possible. And so they agree to be comfortable with the political setup. That'll become your Herodians. Okay, they'll be comfortable with the leadership Rome has set up. And the Sadducees will ally with them to a certain degree. So no, there's no single Judaism. There's no single solution to this. This pressure is going to produce parties and sects that represent subgroupings within Judaism. Yes, all the way back.
So as far as the ambivalence and hostility toward the Gentiles because of this overtaking on account of the disobedience, is this, it seems to kind of just perpetuate the problem to continue to be, to respond in that way. Is this what Jesus reacts so strongly against in terms of the...
In part, yes. That's why I said the New Testament is one answer to this problem. Okay? And the coming of the Messiah is God's answer to the problem. Okay? That's why Jesus drops in the middle of this boiling stew and melting pot situation and tries to help people deal with it. And he does it by bringing a reform movement to Judaism. He sees himself as not detached from Judaism. He sees himself as the completion of what Jews were hoping for. Okay? Again, because we're on the other side of it, and Christianity emerged out of Judaism, we tend to think of these two religions as almost completely distinct. But that's not how they were functioning when Jesus came. And that's important to appreciate about the part of the story. That's why the Jewish background of this story is so critically important. And the Jewish perspective on this story is so critically important. Yes?
How much were those different sects at conflict with each other?
They were in all kinds of conflict with each other. They shared the same territory. They contended for the attitudes of the same people. It's a little bit like asking how much are Democrats and Republicans in contact with one another. Okay, it's the same kind of cultural tension and contention going on for which way is the best way to negotiate this problem we find ourselves in. So they were very much in interaction with one another. The Sadducees and the Pharisees had to share, to some degree, the oversight of Judaism. Now, the Essenes withdrew. The Herodians are those who are supportive of the government. Okay, so there's all kinds of interaction going on here, which, when they band together to deal with Jesus, tells you something else about what they think about him. All right, let's press on here. This is a picture of Jerusalem from the sky today. Let me just point out a couple of areas for you. I don't know if I'm supposed to do this since we're trying to tape this, but I want to get the lights down a little bit so you can see this a little better. Hopefully that doesn't affect the recording. Obviously, this is the Temple Mount. This is now the Dome of the Rock. Of course, that's the location traditionally of the Second Temple. This upper area on the mount was expanded under Herod in significant kinds of ways. But basically, in the period that we're talking about, from Babylon, from the Babylonian period into Jesus' time, the Second Temple period, the bulk of the city was located in, I don't have a clicker, in a region that runs this way. This area right here was known as the Old City of David. And then if you come up to this side, to the other side of the Dome of the Rock, a lot of the key locations in ancient Israel are in this section right next to the temple located on that opposite side of the Dome of the Rock. So in the city that you're seeing towards the outside, you see this kind of highway that's going up the top, et cetera, and all that out there. That's less important to the period we're talking about. Okay?
Which direction is north?
No, I was trying to sort that out in my mind. I think north is this way. Okay? Okay, this is a look in Jerusalem. There's a model of the ancient city of Jerusalem in the Second Temple period, particularly in the time of the first century. And this is a picture of that model. That model is located by they're redoing the Israel Museum right now. Been in Israel 3 times in the last 2 years. I haven't been able to get into the museum yet because they're still wrapping up the complete redo of the museum. But they moved this model, which was located somewhere else, to buy this collection. The Dead Sea Scroll Museum is in the same location. And this is a look at the city of David looking towards, and let's go back because I've determined my directions now. This is south, this is north, east, west. And the city of David runs down the southern portion of the temple. So this next picture is a picture looking from the south to the north towards the southern, what's called the southern steps of the temple, which is the way most people approached the temple in the first century, was from the south. So this area right here is the traditional city of David location. And then the area that was to the other side of the last slide, across from the Dome of the Rock, that's what you're seeing up in the top left-hand corner of the slide. Now let's talk a little bit about political history. We've got the first period of the Babylonian captivity, where Babylon is in charge of the nation, running from 605 to 539. This is disappointing for the South, and it leads to diaspora, to scattering. Thousands and thousands of Jews left the Holy Land during this period, and they either went to Egypt to flee the Babylonians, or they went to Babylon to assimilate or to live under Babylonian rule. The Babylonians defeat Assyria in 612. They defeat Egypt in 605 at Carchemish. And they finally defeat Israel in 586 through Nebuchadnezzar. There are 3 periods of deportation that lead to this diaspora situation that we're talking about. Daniel in 605, Ezekiel about 597, and the attempt to react to the overtaking by the Babylonians that failed in 586. When that revolt of Zedekiah is crushed, that leads to another deportation, with some people going to Egypt rather than Babylon. So you've got, if you think of the Holy Land, and of course, you know the map, you've got the Mediterranean, here's Israel. Some people are going this way into Egypt, other people are going this way into Babylon. Gedaliah is assassinated. This is what Jeremiah 42 to 44 is about. The result is that many flee to Egypt. This is when Jeremiah leaves the Holy Land. Jehoiachin becomes a vassal king or governor under Babylonian authority. In the books that are written in this period and that relate to this period include the books of Daniel, Ezekiel, Lamentations, and Jeremiah. Ezekiel talks about a deportation with about 10,000 people, and that journey is anywhere from 800 to 1,000 miles. And remember, okay, there's no railroad, there's no buses, no cars, no airplanes. Okay, this is by foot. And maybe a few mules or horses. Maybe something like a wagon if you're really lucky. The result of this was the emergence of a forced enculturation. The Babylonians wanted you to assimilate to their culture. And, in effect, a political emasculation. You lost your political sovereignty and your political identity. And in fact, the early chapters of Daniel are about the pressure and the choices that Daniel and others face to live distinctively Jewishly in a culture that's telling them they can't live that way. You remember what puts Daniel and his buddies in trouble and in jail? It's because they are trying to faithfully be Jews in the midst of an enculturation coming from the nations. And that's going to be and remain the perpetual problem. What we see in these books is a conscious effort to hold on to Jewish identity. Something that stands a little bit in contrast to Israel to the north, which tended to assimilate. And this is why people in the south of Israel disliked the Samaritans. Because they felt like the Samaritans were assimilators and were unfaithful to the law, including their multiple cult locations, etc., before we even get to the other nations coming into the north. What happens in other portions of this period is a reorganization around the law. You've lost, to some degree, your theocracy, You've lost your political structure, but you can still be socially structured around the law. And so that's where the Jewish identity went. The central feature of national identity became your ethnic and religious practices that marked you out as distinct. And remember that during some of this period, after the Babylonian captivity, there is no temple. There is no central sacrifice area for these religious practices. So these other practices are going to be what makes you distinct. Now, this is a picture from a location in Israel called the Citadel. It's a museum of the history of Jerusalem. If you ever go to Jerusalem, it's not on the normal, often on the normal tour cycle if you're only there for a few days. But if you can make an effort to get there, it's worth it. It's a terrific museum of the history of Israel, seen through the history of the city of Jerusalem. Anyway, one of these displays, when you're going to see these pictures, you're going to see Arabic and Hebrew as well as English. Anyway, this is a slide that depicts the movement towards Babylon and then the return back under Ezra and Nehemiah. Just so you have a sense of kind of where we're located on a map. Of course, Israel's right here, Jerusalem's right here.
Why did they go up and over like that? Why not just straight across?
Had to do with the topography. It says the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE decimated the population of the city, and it remained desolate for nearly 50 years. When Babylon fell in 538, King Cyrus of Persia became overlord of Judah and allowed the Jews to return to Zion. One of their first acts was to rebuild the temple. One of the differences between the Babylonian approach to these issues of occupation and the Persian approach to the issues of occupation is the Babylonians tried to culturally assimilate their enemies. The Persians tended to allow people to keep their own practices. Okay, they didn't impose or didn't do as much imposition of their culture onto the people that they conquered. And that produced some changes for Israel, including the right to return. Only in 445 BCE, when Nehemiah was appointed governor of Judah, was Jerusalem rebuilt and its walls repaired. Under the leadership of Ezra the scribe, the authority of the law of Moses was restored, and Jerusalem resumed the role as the religious center of Judaism. And by what I've described to you, you can understand why it is that the religious leadership would be attracted to the law. Because it marks out the distinctives of the people, and the fact that they've been overrun by the nations, they've been told by the law, is a reflection of unfaithfulness, so you're going to ratchet up the faithfulness in hopes that that'll do the trick. It's not illogical. Okay? It makes sense from an internal Jewish point of view. Cyrus in 539 represents the arrival of Persian authority. The first return happens in 538 and 537. Here we're dealing with the biblical books of Ezra 1 to 6. Key figures are people like Zerubbabel, Joshua, Haggai, and Zechariah. The reason you have so much messianic-like hope in this period is because these are bright days compared to the dark days of the Babylonian captivity. There is hope. Jerusalem is being restored. Its societal structure is being reorganized. It's a potential period to think positively about what God may be doing. They start to rebuild the temple. That's completed in 516, 70 years after the defeat. But things aren't always good. Sometimes you get a ruler who changes policies. And Haman, under Xerxes I, tries to annihilate the Jews, but fails. And the book of Esther is about the preservation of God, of his people, even though the book of Esther nowhere names God. A later return comes in 457 under Ezra and Zadok, who's basically seen to be the, how do I say this, the dynastic head of what becomes the new line of high priests. The law becomes more central. It's read in public. You get your first emergence of targums to put the law in Aramaic as well as Hebrew, because Aramaic is becoming a dominant language in the culture. The law returns to a central place. The move is to be faithful and distinct. Yet the prophets alongside later declare the fact that there is continued unfaithfulness even in the midst of this effort. Right, I want to begin with a clip, and I'm going to be showing various portions of this. This is the PBS home video on empires called Kingdom of David. And there are certain extracts of this that are extremely well done and that pose questions for us or that make points, I think, particularly powerfully. And I want to begin with one of those clips this morning. And hopefully the sound is up enough that you can hear this and that you can see it.
In the 4th century BC, a remarkable people invaded the Middle East. They were the Greeks. Led by one of the greatest generals in history, Alexander the Great, the Greeks would conquer the world from Greece to India. But there was far more to the Greeks than military prowess. The Greeks had created the most sophisticated civilization the world had ever seen. Their magnificent art was inspired by a reverence for the human body, which also found its expression in the athletic feats on display in their Olympic Games. But the Greeks also revered the mind. And their greatest thinkers were responsible for the flowering of philosophy, science, and mathematics. As a result, Hellenic architecture, politics, and economics were centuries ahead of the other peoples of the world. For the Jews, the takeover of most of the known world by the Greeks was a threat more dire than any a mere army could pose.
When the Greek world expanded ever eastward, ultimately the Jews of the land of Israel found themselves almost literally smack in the middle of the Hellenistic Empire. We were surrounded by Hellenistic culture, and willy-nilly we found ourselves becoming Hellenists. This triggered both a great advance and a great struggle within the Jewish people for how we would identify. Would we simply succumb to Hellenism, or would we somehow maintain our unique identity as a people?
Now, that is precisely the question we posed in the first class, that the arrival of Hellenism produced a challenge for Judaism in terms of its identity. And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at in what we do today. We're going to be considering the period that extends from the early part of the 4th century, and particularly from the period of Alexander the Great in 323, we're basically to 323 BC, all the way up to as close to Pompey and Rome's entry into Jerusalem in 63 BC. This is not the destruction of the temple. This is the taking over of Jerusalem by the Romans. And so our hope is to take a look at this and to examine kind of where we are. And we start today with Alexander the Great. In Judaism, for this period, there is probably no greater source for information than the historian Josephus. Josephus was originally a political leader of the Jewish people. In fact, he was a general. He fought against the Romans starting in the 60s, before the destruction of Jerusalem, AD 60, and lost a battle at Gamla to the Romans in 67, 3 years before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Gamla is in northern Galilee, and we will actually see pictures later on the semester of that site. It happens to preserve one of the few remains that we have of a first century synagogue. Anyway, Josephus was captured by the Romans, came into the Roman court, and began writing about Judaism to the Romans so that they can understand Jewish people better. And he wrote 4 works. One of them was called Antiquities. It covers the history of Israel starting from Genesis and going all the way up to Josephus' time. Second one was called Jewish War, which basically looks at the war in 66 to 70, but starting with the Maccabean struggle that we're going to talk about today. The third one was Against Apion, which is a book in defense of Judaism by someone who is attacking Judaism, Apion. And then the fourth work was called The Life. It was a biography, the theme of which is, what a great guy I am. So that's Josephus, a very significant character, and we would know very much less about this period of history if we did not have Josephus. And during the semester, I'm going to be citing for you portions of Josephus, because part of where we get the information of what you hear about this period comes directly from what he has to tell us. And there's a very famous incident of Alexander coming into Jerusalem that Josephus recounts for us in Antiquities, Book 11. And then the way the material in Josephus is sectioned out is that it's sectioned out by book, chapter, section, and then almost sentence number. It's not quite sentence number, but almost sentence number. And so you see 11:8:5, 3:29 to 31, in case you want to look that up in your Gideon's Josephus later. And this is what he had to say about Alexander's visit to Jerusalem. And when he understood that he was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and multitudes of the citizens. The procession was venerable, and the matter of it different from that of other nations. It reached to a place called Sapha, which name translated into Greek signifies a prospect, for you have thence a prospect of both Jerusalem and of the temple. And when the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans that followed him thought they should have liberty to plunder the city and torment the high priest to death, which the king's displeasure fairly promised them, the very reverse of it happened. For Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the gold plate on which the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself, adored that name, and first saluted the high priest. So this is a story of respect that Alexander shows to the high priest upon his approach to Jerusalem, and indicating a little bit of the character of the Greeks, and that they, on the one hand, conquered, but on the other hand, showed some deference to all religious practice, in that they were very much like the Persians. Now, we talked a little bit about the effects of Hellenism. This is the beginning of Western civilization as we know it, and the goal of the Hellenists was to try and create one culture that extended from the east, what we call the Far East today, because Alexander's conquering went as far as India, all the way over to the west. His soldiers marched 11,000 miles in 8 years. Okay? And that may not sound like a lot, but remember, you're doing all that by foot or on horse and carrying supplies. There is the flowering of intellect, and there is a focus on the individual. The film talked about the worship of the human body. That was a part of this impact. And the idea of thinking about the individual and his rights and his role in the state is something that goes back into Hellenism for us. Most thinking was done very corporately up to this time. It was the group that you belonged to that was by far more important than the individual. This is a full culture that was exported everywhere and it expanded trade. One of the innovations of the Hellenists was the invention of money as opposed to bartering. So instead of trading goods for goods, they established a monetary system which then allowed the opening up of trade. Religiously, Hellenism was chaos in the sense that there were gods everywhere, but, and this is extremely important, everybody believed in some form of what I'm describing as an animated creation. Everyone had a belief that there were gods and spirits out there, something beyond what you could see, touch, feel, or taste. And so this plethora of options spiritually opened up a very polytheistic, multi-religious, pluralistic cultural option for Judaism. But it's not like today. Today, in many parts of the world, there is this pluralism, but many people don't have any belief in anything beyond the material world. And so in that sense, the ancient world is very, very different. If you walk into Pompeii, which is just in the region of Naples in Italy, and is across, of course, from the famous eruption of Mount Vesuvius, where that culture was basically snapshotted in soot for all time. If you walk into Pompeii and you look at the houses, in the living rooms, you will see little niches, little carved out areas where the family gods would be placed and where offerings would be offered daily in the homes. So this is a very religious culture, even though the variety of gods are there, because the idea was you barter with the gods, and the more gods you barter with, the better off you will be long term in terms of your well-being. All of this, both culturally and religiously, put pressure on Jewish tradition and lifestyle, and every Jew was forced with a choice. Do they acclimate and assimilate to the culture and to the religion that Hellenism was introducing, or do they resist it, or do they do something in between? And all those options were taken. So now we come to the Maccabean period, and the entire situation that is associated with it, the lead up into what certainly is one of the more significant events of Jewish history. After Alexander died, he died at 33, there really were no successors in place that were a part of his family. So what happened is that there was a group of generals who were to share power. These are known as the Diadochi, or the successors. And we're dealing here with the period from 336 to 301. Alexander had conquered much of the known world, extending as far as I noted as India. When he got to India, his soldiers basically told him they had had enough. And so they returned back home. The relationship to Jews was a relationship of respect but cultural encroachment. And the passage that we read for you from Antiquities reflects the idea of respect. But also during this time, the fact that Alexander's empire covered Egypt on the one hand, and we're going to find out about the Ptolemies who ruled there, and Syria on the other. We're going to find out about the Seleucids who ruled there, with Israel caught in the middle on the border between two parts of Alexander's former kingdom. This led to cultural chaos because Israel basically became a pawn and a battleground between Egypt and Syria over the next 150 years. Greek culture spread into Palestine. The religion of the Greeks is highly syncretistic. They simply absorb gods. So if Egypt has a god or Syria has a god, they just add it to the pantheon. Divine veneration of the ruler begins to emerge. Rulers begin to be called sons of God during this time. And Alexander's generals share rule in 20 satrapies. These are kind of governmental districts under 3 successive regents. And there's all kinds of power grabbing that takes place between 323 and 301. And Palestine, or Israel, in the next 150 years will change hands 6 times between Syria and Egypt. That's how buffered it is in this battle. There is a fourfold alliance that emerges in the power struggle in the 20-so-odd years after Alexander's death. And this fourfold alliance emerges in 301 as a result of a battle in a corner of Alexander's empire called Ipsus. Ptolemy I has control of Egypt. Seleucus I has control of Syria. Those are going to be the 2 most important regions for the history of Israel. Lysimachus is in control of Thrace, which is in the region of Greece. And Antipater and his son Cassander have the power over Macedonia. So those are the 4 divisions that come out of the struggle for power in the 20-some-odd years, 22 years after Alexander's death. Here's how 1 Maccabees describes. 1 Maccabees is a work of what is often called the Apocrypha, but really is a Second Temple Jewish historical work from between the period of the Testaments. And 1 Maccabees is another key source for the events that we are going to describe. And it starts off with Alexander. This is the very beginning of the book. After Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth. Notice that expression, which is going to be an idiom in some of the stuff that we're going to be reading over the next few weeks. And plundered many nations. And when the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army, ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they became tributary to him. After this, he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. So he summoned his most honored officers who had been brought up with him from youth and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. That's the initial transition of power to the Diadochi. Now, in this period, running from 300 to the Maccabean War starts in 167. There is this back and forth that Israel goes through with Egypt and Syria. Egypt starts off in control. Basically, Israel was under the rule of the Ptolemy family. And there were 6 wars between Syria and the Seleucids, which is the kingdom of the north in the book of Daniel, Daniel 11. And Egypt, the Ptolemies, who represented the south, 6 wars in a period of just slightly over 100 years. Starting in 274 and running down to 168. So that's a lot of conflict back and forth. And unfortunately, Israel is right smack in the middle of these 2 kingdoms. Palestine becomes a pawn or a buffer between Egypt and Syria for almost 2 centuries, and the high priest really ran the country alongside the Ptolemies in Egypt, at least as long as Egypt was running things. And we're going to see that the political role of the high priest is going to become crucial as we move into the Maccabean period, and then also as we move into the rule of the Maccabees, also known as the Hasmoneans, in the period after the Maccabean War. The high priest then is not merely a religious leader, but he has political power and political overtones. There are political overtones to his rule. In Alexandria, in Egypt, the beginnings of a new translation of the Hebrew Scriptures is started in a work that becomes known as the LXX, or the Septuagint. The number 70 or 72 being associated with the traditions of how this was translated originally, and another intertestamental work known as the Letter of Aristeas, presents the story of the initial translation of the Torah. And we're going to take a look at that in just a second. Josephus also relates basically the same story that the letter of Aristeas has. The synagogue and the Sanhedrin, or elders' council, also develops during this period, as Jews have to develop a form of local rule. Remember, Jews have been dispersed. They aren't simply in Judea. We have some in Babylon. We have some in Egypt. They're scattered across the Middle East. And so there are these local councils, or Sanhedrin, that develop to help oversee the affairs of Jewish people. And the synagogue becomes the center of Jewish community in many of these locations. Again, the temple is rebuilt and is functioning, but if you are a diaspora Jew a long way away from Jerusalem, there's no central location around which to gather to have sacrifices. So what becomes the alternative? Well, what happens is that there becomes a house of prayer and a house of instruction and a community center, all of which together form the basis for establishing synagogues. There is some effort on the part of some to promote good relations between the Jews and the Gentiles. And in fact, part of the theme of the letter of Aristeas that I told you about is that the Jews and the Gentiles are able to get along, that there doesn't have to be hostility between them. There is peaceful Hellenization as long as taxes are paid and there is no rebellion, and the Ptolemies, the Egyptian kings, are happy. Okay, so as long as there's peace, everything is rocking along nicely in this situation. Now here's the letter of Aristeas telling the story of how the translation from Hebrew into Greek of the Torah took place. 3 days later, Demetrius took the men passing along the seawall, 7 stadia long, to the island and crossed the bridge and made for the northern districts of Pharos. There he assembled them in a house which had been built upon the seashore of great beauty in a secluded situation. See, the Septuagint was translated during a religious retreat. And invited them to carry out the work of translation, since everything that they needed for the purpose was placed at their disposal. So they set to work comparing their several results and making them agree, and whenever they agreed upon was suitably copied out under the direction of Demetrius, and the session lasted until the 9th hour. After this, they were set free to minister to their physical needs. So they worked hard and translated all day. Everything they wanted was furnished for them on a lavish scale. This translation had been ordered, according to the letter, by the king of the Ptolemies, who was in the process of building a huge library in Alexandria to collect all the great books of the world. And so that's why they're undertaking this process. Alexandria was one of the key locations where dispersed Jews ended up. In the time of the New Testament, the city is divided into 5 districts. One district in Alexandria is completely Jewish, and a second district in Alexandria is mostly Jewish. So the Jewish population of the city was somewhere around 33 to 40% of the total. Now, just to give you an idea of scale, the estimates are that Jews comprised about 7% of the population of the Roman Empire. So that tells you how Jewish Alexandria was. Anyway, everything they wanted was furnished for them on a lavish scale. In addition to this, Dorotheus made the same preparations for them daily as were made for the king himself, for thus he had been commanded by the king. In the early morning they appeared daily at the court, and after saluting the king went back to their own place. And as is the custom of all Jews, they washed their hands in the sea, prayed to God, and then devoted themselves to reading and translating the particular passage on which they were engaged. Sounds like seminary, doesn't it? And I put the question to them, why is it that they washed their hands before they prayed? And they explained it was a token that they had done no evil, for every form of activity is wrought by means of the hands. Since in their noble and holy way they regard everything as a symbol of righteousness and truth. You begin to see the flavor of what religious purity is all about in the thinking of the Jewish people. The text goes on. As I have already said, they met together daily in the place which was delightful for its quiet and its brightness, and applied themselves to their task. And so it chanced that the work of translation was completed in 72 days, just as if this had been arranged of set purpose. When the work was completed, Demetrius collected together the Jewish population in the place where the translation had been made and read it over to all in the presence of the translators, who met with great reception also from the people because of the great benefits which they had conferred on them. So you can see that the feel of this is that this is a significant event, a wonderful translation. They bestowed warm praise upon Demetrius, too, and urged him to have the whole law transcribed and to present a copy to their leaders. After the books had been read, the priests and the elders of the translators and the Jewish community and the leaders of the people stood up and said that since so excellent and sacred and accurate a translation had been made, it was only right that it should remain as it was, and no alteration should be made in it. And when the whole company expressed their approval, they bade them pronounce a curse in accordance with their custom upon any who should make any alteration, either by adding anything or changing in any way whatever any of the words which had been written, or by making any omission. This was a very wise precaution to ensure that the book might be preserved for all future time unchanged. Now, the reason this text is so important is you can get a feel for how the Septuagint is viewed within Judaism before we ever get to the time of Jesus. And the reason this becomes important is because by the time we get to the New Testament, the Septuagint is a widely used translation, and in fact, many of the translations that we have in our New Testament of the Hebrew Scriptures reflect Septuagintal readings vis-a-vis the Masoretic text. So it's important to understand the translation background and translation history of this text as we think about it. Okay, let me stop and see if there are any questions. Yeah?
Was it like even a divine action that they translated the Septuagint?
Yeah, there's a part of this that I didn't cite for you that basically says there's a part of this legend associated with this, that the translators separately went into their rooms, translated the text, and when they came out and compared the translations, they all matched. Okay? Now, anyone who's done Greek 101 or 102 class would know how amazing that is. All right? So, yeah.
So in 72 days, each person translated, was it a major piece of the Old Testament, or was it the entire?
We don't have a schedule of how fast they proceeded, but just think about how long the Pentateuch is and ask yourself how fast you're moving to do that in 72 days. So it's, you're covering several chapters a day. Yeah, Rob.
Seeing kind of the multifaceted makeup of Judaism in the period, based on one thing that was said, the salute of the king, would these translators have been completely acceptable to Orthodox Jews at the time, in terms of what they're doing with the Hebrew Scripture?
Well, the issue of translating the Hebrew Scripture becomes a necessity, okay? Because some people only know Greek. That's why you do it. So they're no longer learning Hebrew. In some cases, in other parts of the world, they're only learning Aramaic. That's why you have the Targums developing slightly after this time as we move from Hebrew to Aramaic as well. What was important to Jewish people was that people knew the contents of the book. And so to do it in translation is not necessarily seen as a problem. And the fact that so many translators are put into the process, into the mix, is a way of trying to guarantee the quality of the translation. Okay? Mm-hmm.
Is Aristeas, is he a Jew or is he a colonized Jew or is he Greek?
This is an explanation of Jewish practice in a Greek context, basically. So the letter to Aristeas is written to explain to him because he wouldn't be familiar with the customs, what is going on. and why this is seen as such a positive thing. And the thrust of this letter as a whole is the idea that Jews and Greeks are able to get along. We're going to see other works that don't have this generous spirit attached to them. Okay? Yes?
Did you say exactly how many people helped with the Septuagint?
Well, the tradition is that it was 70 or 72. It's debated. 72 days, 70 translators is the way it's normally put together. Mm-hmm.
Going back to the conflict between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, what was so desirable about the southern Palestine area?
Well, it basically gave you access to everything to the east. Think about the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, and think about your way into the Middle East if you're coming from Europe. Okay, or you're coming from northwest Asia. Okay, it's a way in to key parts of the Middle East and then across over into India. So it's topographically, politically, and strategically significant. Okay, let's transition now and talk about Antiochus Epiphanes. And I have two things I want to do here. I want to overview the period of Antiochus Epiphanes, and then I want to take a little bit of time and show you another rather long clip that does a beautiful job of explaining some of the key characters and some of the key events associated with this. In 167, actually slightly earlier than this, the fourth Seleucid ruler, Antiochus IV, appeared. He wasn't exactly the most humble of guys. Epiphanes means Antiochus the manifestation, by which he means the manifestation of a divine presence. There was a wordplay that was done off his name that translated into Antiochus the madman. Now what's happened in the interim is this, is that we have come through these 6 battles, and what eventually happens is that the Seleucids lose to Rome, who is emerging from the north. In losing to Rome, they have to sign a huge reparations agreement for peace. And they have to pay a huge amount of taxes to Rome as tribute. So Antiochus has got a practical problem. He needs a monetary stimulus bill. Okay? All right? He needs to be able to raise large amounts of money to pay this tax that he owes the Romans, and he has no choice. So when we see Antiochus moving around and land grabbing and trying to get control of Egypt and other places, he's doing this as an attempt to raise the funds that he needs to pay off the Romans. It's important to appreciate about him because most people don't realize that that's part of what's motivating him. The other half of the equation is he's committed to Hellenization. In being committed to Hellenization, he wants to be sure that everybody assimilates to the dominant culture. By the way, this is an instinct that's still with us today. Think about the debates that we get into about how people should assimilate to the American culture if they come to the United States. Okay, only in this case, you export it as well. So in 167, Antiochus Epiphanes IV gave an edict forcing Hellenization. All the reasons for this edict are not clear. However, what is happening as we move into this period is that we've had a series of efforts to purchase the high priesthood and negotiate with the high priesthood, and we've moved outside the genealogical lines. In other words, there is corruption all over the place. And so Menelaus bids to buy the priesthood, and of course, what does Antiochus need? He needs money. So someone comes and says, I'll pay you X amount for the high priesthood, and another guy comes along and says, I'll pay you X plus that amount for the priesthood. What are you going to do if you're the ruler? You're going to get as much money as you can. The leading families are continuing to fight for control of the situation, and Menelaus, as he bought the priesthood, allowed further reforms and plundered the temple to try and pay off his bid. He also got one of the old priests, one of the old respected priests at the beginning of this sequence, Onias III, assassinated. Now, these stories are told in another book that's in the Apocrypha, 2 Maccabees. Let me talk a second about these works. These books that we're talking about that are in the Apocrypha were not viewed as scripture by Jewish people, but they were respected as writings about Jewish heritage. Most of you go to Christian bookstores and you buy Christian books. And you read Christian books. And when you buy them, you don't go, well, I'm reading this because it's scripture. You buy it because you think to read it is helpful. It will instruct you in some way. Or it's telling you something about an area that you need to know. Well, that's how these apocryphal works functioned in Judaism. There was this recognition that knowing about your heritage was helpful. So after these events took place, and after they took place and these events were recorded in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, these books became an important part of the Jewish heritage because they recorded these events that were so key to the history of Judaism. We have Jason fighting Menelaus. Jason was Menelaus' opponent in trying to bargain for the priesthood. And Antiochus, having just lost to Rome, Antiochus IV goes to Jerusalem, supports Menelaus, and Jewish practice becomes outlawed. Copies of the Torah are destroyed, and the temple becomes a place of worship for Zeus, Athena, and Dionysius. Now you can just imagine how the Jews felt about their temple being converted into a pagan temple. He required the eating of pork. He required that pork be offered at a temple altar, and at an altar both at the temple and at other locales. Okay, so not just in the central temple, but also at other worship places. All of this is recorded in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The righteous end up being persecuted, and the edict operated for 3 years while the Jews tried to reverse this through violent engagement, through what became the Maccabean War. The edict and its practices spawned the Maccabean revolt, and the rise of the Hasmonean family under Mattathias and then Judas Mattathias shows the zeal for the law. With the support of the Hasidim, who are the ancestors to the Pharisees, the holy ones, these were the pious or righteous ones, they eventually recaptured Jerusalem and restored the temple worship in Kislev 164. And this story is told in 1 Maccabees 4, 36 to 61. And the celebration known as Hanukkah, or the Feast of Lights, that takes place in the Jewish calendar right about Christmas time every year, is the celebration of this victory. Shows you how important it is. Here is a map of the Hasmonean kingdom at its zenith, as well as a description of Antiochus Epiphanes that you would read if you went to this museum on the history of Jerusalem that I told you about that's in the citadel in Jerusalem. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, 175 to 163 are the dates of his rule, introduced radical changes into Jerusalem's culture and social life. The Hellenization of the city and religious persecutions provoked the Hasmonean or Maccabean revolt, which culminated in the Jewish recapture of the temple in 164 BCE. Full independence was regained by Simon the Maccabee in 161. So they fought and regained control in 164, but they continued to battle on and off over the next 23 years until Simon the Maccabee finally regained control in 141. Jerusalem became the capital of the Hasmonean kingdom, And however, the city's cultural and social life continued to be profoundly influenced by Hellenism. The Hasmonean kingdom enjoyed political independence for about 80 years until its conquest by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BCE. So we're entering into this key period in which there is a short, about 80-year period of independence. And then, again, back into Roman hands. Okay, now, just to review, let's see what 1 Maccabees has to say about this period. And what you will see in this passage is the feelings that come through about the encroachment of Hellenism. From them came forth a sinful root, talking about the kings of Alexander's descendants. That is, the general's descendants. Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. That's Antiochus the IV and Antiochus the III. He had been a hostage in Rome, and he began to reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. That number is tallied from Alexander's rule. In those days, certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, "Let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us, for since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us." So here is a group wanting to have peace with the Hellenists and reflect their culture. This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem. A gymnasium in ancient culture wasn't just a workplace. It was like a school place, an education place, athletic activity, which all took place in the nude because of this elevation of the human body. All of that that aspect was particularly offensive to the Jews. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom, and removed the marks of circumcision and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. The writer doesn't like that this is happening. Now, on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by the decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their heart not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or profane the Holy Covenant, and they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. Now we turn to the Maccabees. What did this cause? Well, this caused the rising up of a certain group of people who were zealous for the law. In those days, Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, priest of the family of Jorib, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modin. Modin is located between Jerusalem, which is kind of in the middle of Israel, and Tel Aviv, which is located on the coast, where if you fly into Israel, that's where you fly in. It's right between those two locations. Still a functioning city today. He had 5 sons. John, surnamed Gaddi, Simon, called Thassi, Judas, called Maccabeus. Now you see where the name Maccabees comes from. Eleazar, called Avaron, and Jonathan, called Aphus. He saw the blasphemies being committed in Judah and Jerusalem and said, "Alas, why was I born to see this, the ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city, and to live where it was given over to the enemy, the sanctuary given over to aliens?" Again, you can see, even sense the emotion. And actually, the entirety of 1 Maccabees chapters 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 has this feel to it, this sense of regret and lamentation over what happened to the city as a reflection of the way people felt about what was going on with the Hellenization. The king's officers who were enforcing the apostasy came to the town of Modin to make them offer sacrifice. Now remember, they're going to sacrifice a pig. They're going to sacrifice a pig outside the temple. So there are multiple violations of the law involved here. Many of it from Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. Then the king's officers spoke to Mattathias as follows: "You are a leader, honored and great in this town, and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all the Gentiles and the people of Judah and those that are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts. So come and sacrifice, support the Hellenization, and the state will reward you as a leader." But Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left." And when he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modin, according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal. And there's a traditional Jewish phrase that talks about people burning with zeal for the law. This is where it comes from. He burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice. He tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, son of Zalud. So this is the beginning, according to the book of Maccabees, of the struggle to regain the observance of the law in Israel. And the Maccabean family is the family that stood up for the law. And Judas Maccabees becomes the key figure in this situation. Okay, I'm gonna exit the slides here, and we've got another clip that I want to show you.
The first of the Seleucid kings were content to let Greek culture gradually transform their subjects into Greeks. But in 185 BC, a very unusual man ascended to the Seleucid throne. He was Antiochus IV, but he was known to his subjects as Antiochus the Madman. One of Antiochus' first decrees, recorded in the book of Maccabees, demanded that all his subjects replace their ancestral traditions with Greek ones.
The king issued a proclamation to his whole kingdom that all were to become a single people, each renouncing his particular customs.
Many peoples of the region had already adopted the Greek way of life, but not devout Jews. Now they would be faced with a choice: give up their faith or fight to defend it. Antiochus relied at first on a faction of Jews who had embraced all things Greek. To increase their influence, he sold one such Jew the most important job in Jerusalem, high priest of the temple.
Jason usurped the high priesthood by giving Antiochus a promise of 360 talents of silver. As soon as he was in power, Jason set about converting his fellow countrymen to the Greek way of life.
Now, Jason was the first to bid for the priesthood outside of an official line of succession. And then Menelaus, who I mentioned earlier, outbid him. So once you start this process, it's a difficult process to stop.
For a high priest in Jerusalem in the 2nd century, the question was quite simple. Do I jump on the Greek bandwagon or not? Do I remain separate, or do I throw my lot in with a social process that had taken over all of the Middle East at this time? We find high priests that were willing to take that extra step and to throw their lot in with the lot of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. This would create a reaction, a violent reaction, because there were Jews who considered this to be nothing less than heresy.
Circumcision was the ultimate symbol marking a man as a Jew. But under the new high priest, many temple priests began having cosmetic surgery to disguise their circumcisions, so they could take part naked in the Greek games.
The Hellenizing process reached such a pitch that the priests ceased to show any interest in the services of the altar. They would hurry to take part as soon as the signal was given for the games.
There were certain things about Greek culture and civilization that were totally unacceptable to the Jews. Among these, of course, was the religious concept of a multiplicity of gods. You cannot possibly imagine such a thing as being acceptable to Jews. Also, there were certain kinds of behavior. For example, the gymnasium with naked athletics. But really behind that isn't so much the nakedness as the virtual worship of the human body. These types of concepts, theological and we might say behavioral, were just totally unacceptable to most Jews.
According to the book of Maccabees, the ultimate insult to the Jews came when Antiochus ordered that the heart and soul of Judaism, the temple in Jerusalem, be transformed into a Greek temple.
The king sent a man to compel the Jews to profane the temple in Jerusalem and dedicate it to the Olympian Zeus. The temple was filled with reveling and debauchery by the pagans, who took their pleasure with prostitutes and had intercourse with women in the sacred precincts.
The uprising against Antiochus began in the countryside, for the king had ordered his men to travel from village to village with an idol of Zeus.
The king's commissioners came to the town of Modein to make them sacrifice. Many Israelites gathered around them, but Mattathias and his sons drew apart. The king's commissioners then addressed Mattathias. You are a respected leader, a great man in this town. Be the first to step forward and obey the king's decree. You and your sons shall be honored with gold and silver and many presents. Raising his voice, Mattathias retorted, even if every nation living in the king's dominion obeys him, I, my sons and my brothers will still follow the covenant of our ancestors. As he finished speaking, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar. When Mattathias saw this, he was fired with zeal. He killed the king's commissioners and tore down the altar. Then he fled with his sons into the hills.
Mattathias and his sons would soon become known as the Maccabees. Their uprising was proof that the Jews' commitment to the religion of the divine book had become so strong they would die to defend it.
The Maccabees went to war to put an end to the religious persecution, to reclaim the temple, to purify it. In the history of the world, this is the very first war that we know of that people went to war over religious freedom or freedom of conscience. This is the first time a state tampered with a religious tradition, which resulted in the people saying, no, we will go to fight. We cannot tolerate this. That is the War of the Maccabees.
Many of the Maccabean rebels hid in caves in the countryside to avoid Antiochus' army. Not only were they greatly outnumbered, they faced the serious handicap of having to fight according to biblical law. The Bible said it was illegal to fight on the Sabbath day. So when the Greeks tried to smoke out a large group of rebels during Sabbath, the rebels decided they would rather die and seek their reward in the next life than break God's law.
They offered no opposition. Not a stone was thrown. There was no barricading of the hiding places. They only said, "Let us all die innocent. Let heaven and earth bear witness that you are massacring us with no pretense of justice." The attack was pressed home on the Sabbath itself, and they were slaughtered with their wives and children to the number of 1,000 persons.
This introduces the issue of martyrdom for the first time in something of a systematic way. We hear of Jews, for instance, refusing to fight on the Sabbath, and they are martyred. The Maccabean uprising then not only became the classic example of Jews fighting for their religion, but it became the first classic example of Jews willing to die for their religion.
But after the massacres, the surviving rebels decided to reconsider the matter of Sabbath observance. And the uncertainty that existed over the Bible's meaning gave them the freedom they needed.
They said to one another, "If we all do as our brothers have done and refuse to fight, they will only destroy us the sooner from the earth." So then and there they came to this decision. If anyone attacks us on the Sabbath day, we will resist them. We must not all be killed as our brothers were in the hiding places.
The Maccabees ruled, and it seems to have been followed by Jewish tradition forever after, that in a defensive war, one not only was permitted to set aside Sabbath restrictions, but one was obligated to do so.
After the death of Mattathias, his son Judah took over the leadership of the rebels. Judah was both a brilliant military strategist and a charismatic leader who used the stories of the Bible to inspire his followers.
First light found Judah preparing for battle in the plain. Though his men lacked the armor and swords they could have wished, Judah said to his men, "Do not be afraid of their numbers, and do not flinch at their attack. Remember how our ancestors were delivered at the Red Sea when Pharaoh was pursuing them in force. The foreigners looked up, and seeing the Jews advancing against them, came out of the camp to join battle. Judah's men sounded the trumpet and engaged them. The pagans were routed and fled toward the plain, and all the stragglers fell by the sword.
After a string of victories over the Greeks, Judah's men began to call him Judah the Maccabee, Judah the Hammer.
Judah Maccabee is some kind of amazing giant figure in our historical tradition. Here you've got this man who rises up against the unbelievable power of the Seleucid Empire, who fights battles with massive armies, and who stands on the one hand for Torah and tradition, but on the other hand knows how to make deals with the Romans and how to fight against the Seleucids. So we are speaking here about someone who must have been literally a giant in his own time.
In 164 BC, 3 years after the revolt began, the Maccabees finally conquered Jerusalem. Their first official act was to remove all Greek influence from the temple and rededicate it to their one true God.
Maccabeus and his companions restored the temple and the city. They purified the sanctuary and built a new altar. Then, striking fire from flints, they offered the first sacrifice for 2 years, and burned incense and lit the lamps.
Judah Maccabee will enter the city. He will have to purify the temple, because the temple had gone through a process of Hellenization. Pagan rites had been introduced into the temple, and Judah Maccabee would purify, rededicate the temple, this of course leading to the renowned festival of Hanukkah, the dedication of the Jewish temple anew.
Okay, that's the Maccabean War. I think told very effectively in that special highlighting the features that are associated with its execution and the role of the Maccabean family. The Maccabees were so successful in this that there were introduced all kinds of innovations as a result of their efforts, and these innovations will bring another shock to Israel. The Maccabean revolt and its effects are as follows. In the first stage, they regain their religious freedom, as we just saw. There are letters from Antiochus the fifth that acknowledge that Israel has the right to worship. You can see Antiochus the fifth. Antiochus the fourth has moved off the scene. And this intensifies the nationalist identity of the Hasidim parties. Those who believed in purity of the law had now successfully fought for the preservation of the law and customs of the nation. And these parties will begin to split for reasons that I'm about to tell you. This intensifies divisions in the nation between the secularist compromisers who had committed themselves to Hellenization on the one hand, and the faithful. So we've got pro and anti-Hellenists in the society. In the second stage, which ran from 164 to all the way down to the rule of Simon in extending to 134, after bouncing back and forth again with the Seleucids over this 20-year period, in 142, Demetrius II acknowledges that Israel no longer needs to pay taxes to Syria, and they have their economic freedom. Part of the way in which this was done was in some careful negotiating that was done between two parties fighting for the crown in Syria. And Israel lent its support to the weaker ruler to put him over the top, if you will, and defeat his rival. And this was the gratitude that was expressed back to them for helping this ruler to come to power in Syria, was that no taxes were to be paid. So some pretty clever political negotiations are a part of this. Again, the issue that we're dealing with is the preservation of Jewish values and the preservation of their homeland versus foreign rule. And when the Maccabees come to power and a Jewish rule is reestablished within the land, what this does is to nurture the high hopes that perhaps now we're back on track as a nation. The nation is back in control, and there's a potential for a new theocracy under the law. At least that's what the pious had hoped, is that this new rule of Jewish rulers at the top of the hierarchy politically in the land would redirect the people back towards the law. But there was an innovation that was instituted. And that is going to become a cause of great friction. The controversial innovation was this, that in gratitude for the victory, the political victory, the office of king and high priest was now combined into one figure. No longer did we have an Aaronic priest and a king. Now we have a priest king. Not only did this not have the correct genealogy for the Davidic or high priestly office, but this was seen as a violation of the law in combining two offices that had been designed to be separate. The question becomes, how could they justify doing this? And the answer is, they will claim it is a temporary arrangement. Independent home rule becomes established under Simon as the Syrians are defeated at Gezer and at the citadel of Acra in 142 and in 141 respectively. And what's really important is that the Romans recognize the Maccabean government. So the Romans basically say to the Syrians, keep your hands off of Israel. Now, this combining of offices, high priest and king, angers the Essenes, the group that became the separatists who moved out to Qumran. And we're going to detail that for you in just a second. They withdraw to the desert, and some of them withdraw to the desert and form a community at Qumran that becomes the location of the now famous Dead Sea Scrolls. For them, Jonathan the Hasmonean, or Jonathan Hyrcanus' priesthood, which extended from 160 to 143, he's the ruler before Simon comes onto the scene, is wicked. Political intrigue emerges as Simon is slain by his son-in-law named Ptolemy in 134, and John Hyrcanus follows, who is Simon's son and the high priest, and he becomes a militaristic ruler who is as ruthless in the exercise of his power as any pagan king who had been in the land beforehand. Israel, as a result, is psychologically shaken, and she is badly divided. Here are the texts that indicate to us this move of combining priest and king. In 1 Maccabees 14, 25 and 26, it says, when the people heard these things, they said, how shall we thank Simon and his sons? For he and his brothers and the house of his father have stood firm. They have fought and repulsed Israel's enemies and established its freedom. And then later on in the same chapter, the people saw Simon's faithfulness and the glory that he had resolved to win for his nation, and they made him their leader and high priest. Because he had done all these things, because of the justice and loyalty that he had maintained toward his nation, he sought in every way to exalt his people. How can they justify this? The Jews and their priests have resolved that Simon should be their leader and high priest forever until a trustworthy prophet should arise, and that he should be governor over them, and that he should take charge of the sanctuary and appoint officials over its tasks and over the country and the weapons and the strongholds, and that he should take charge of the sanctuary, and that he should be obeyed by all, and that all contracts in the country should be written in his name, and that he should be clothed in purple and wear gold. So this is a temporary arrangement until a prophet shall arise, probably an allusion to a prophet like Moses. In other words, until the time of God's deliverance might come. There is a sense in some of this writing that with the reestablishment of kingship in the land, that we are moving towards the last days, the end times. And of course, the Hasmoneans think it belongs with them in the victory that God has given them and given the nation. And the Essenes, who move out to the desert, believe that it belongs with them because they have not compromised the law. So this introduces a split within Judaism, and Judaism is fracturing into a variety of expressions. This is what the Essenes thought of what was taking place with the Hasmoneans. Remember, the Essenes don't like what's taking place. Look, all of them take up a taunt against him and invent sayings about him, saying, Ho, one who grows large on what is not his. How long will he burden himself down with debts? Now, that's a citation of Habakkuk 2:5-6. And this text that I'm reading from is called the Pesher on Habakkuk. It's the interpretation of Habakkuk according to the Qumran community. The text continues. This refers to the wicked priest who had a reputation for reliability at the beginning of his term of service, but when he became ruler over Israel, he became proud and forsook God and betrayed the commandments for the sake of riches. He amassed by force the riches of the lawless who had rebelled against God, seizing the riches of the peoples, thus adding to the guilt of his crimes, and he committed abhorrent deeds in every defiling impurity. Not exactly an endorsement of his rule. Okay, so you can see the tension that's emerging here as a result of the choices that are being made. This is a picture of the Qumran caves out in the desert by the Dead Sea, where the Essene community withdrew to live and await the deliverance of God on their behalf. That's what they were expecting, because they thought they were in the end times. Now, what we have as we move towards Pompeii is a short return by the Seleucids one more time in 133 to 128 under Antiochus VII. But this effort was defeated by John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus extended the Hasmonean rule by conquering Samaria and Idumea. This was the home of Antipater and the Herods to come later. He used mercenaries. He was an expansionist king who fought with what was considered to be pagan, impure armies by hiring these mercenaries. And of course, he collected taxes so he could pay for it. This is the amassing of the riches that the Pasher Habakkuk was talking about. So there was a golden age hope that began at the beginning of this rule, but it is crumbling. Okay? Even as Hyrcanus is expanding the power of the kingship and is conquering more land, there's a sense that something's amiss. Something is not quite right with this rule of Israeli kings over the land of Israel. Hyrcanus fuses an alliance with Rome, which is important to his long-term well-being. And opponents begin to arise, namely the Pharisees, this pious group that operates in honor of the law. They have not withdrawn to the desert. They have not become separatists. They have hung in and are fighting and engaging in the culture for the law. The reason they have opposed John Hyrcanus is that they feel like his rule is not based on the Torah. They will fall out of favor under Hyrcanus. They will fall back into favor with later rulers. The supporters of Hyrcanus are the Sadducees, the nobility and aristocracy who opt for the status quo and cooperation both with the Hasmonean rulers and ultimately as well with the Hellenists who are in the country. So you can see how opposed the Sadducees and the Pharisees are to one another. They're on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. And Judaism is fragmenting. This shows you how much a threat Jesus is when he comes on the scene and he is able to make allies out of ideological enemies. Right, I want to engage in a review, and then I also noticed that in going through the class last time, I actually noticed this while it was happening, but I wasn't sure what had caused it. I missed 2 slides that I want to go back and recover. But first, when we left, we had moved past the Maccabean War, but you remember that our story begins with Alexander the Great and the Diadochi, and I just wanted to give you a visual picture of their territories and kind of what we're dealing with. In the period that led into the Hasmoneans, we had the Ptolemies on one side operating in Egypt, and we had the Seleucids operating in Syria, in Antioch of Syria, one of the major cities that runs through this entire period. You can see where that's located on the map. You can see how far Syria and Seleucia flows over into the Middle East, and that's part of what I wanted you to see. You've got other groupings related to Cassander and Lysander up in the Asia Minor area, and what also was the remainders of Greece in the period before we get to Rome. So that's an important map in terms of just getting a sense of how much territory Alexander first conquered and then where his influence ended up. So that's note number one. Let me go to the second thing that I want to try and cover before we get caught up to where we are. In the midst of the tensions that existed in the period of before the Maccabees, there was a series of actions, I alluded to this last time but didn't develop it, that where the priesthood was basically for sale. And we talked about the last one of these exchanges, but not the first one. And the key period here is the period between Seleucid rule in 200, around 200 BC, and in 198, where Egypt was defeated at Panias, which is actually the same place as Caesarea Philippi. It's going to be important when we get to the New Testament later, in the northern part of Israel. By Antiochus III in what is called Syrian War number 5. Remember, I told you there were 6 wars between Syria and Egypt in the period from the end of Alexander the Great until we get to the Maccabean War. So Palestine's a political football. Around this time of Syrian War number 5, the Jewish priest Onias II is in place. And there are pro-Seleucid gains. He is pro-Seleucid, so he's with Syria. And remember that Israel is in control of Egypt right now, the Ptolemies. But Onias II was pro-Seleucid, and he gains favor, even though, as a Jewish priest, with Antiochus III. He stops paying taxes to Egypt. Joseph Tobiah, who's a member of another leading family in Israel, and is the financier for Hellenism, and Onias II's nephew, all these people are related to one another. It's kind of like West Virginia. No, just kidding. Does pay it, keeping the peace. And in the Antiquities, Book 12, Josephus even notes the Syrian support for the temple during this period. So the Jewish leadership is split in terms of who they're supporting, Egypt or Syria. They're divided with regard to whom they're going to support. And most key Jews switched support to Antiochus III as he appeared to gain power and were ready to embrace him when he defeated Egypt. It was an easy move for Israel to just switch and be comfortable with the leadership. Now, the Seleucids were stopped by Rome at Thermopylae in Magnesia in 190. They signed this treaty at Apamea in 188 BC, which requires serious payment of vast taxes to Rome. We did talk about that last class period. And so what we're getting in the period around the 200 to 190 area is Rome is beginning to emerge as the world power. And it sets the stage for this major shock to Israel's history as Antiochus IV, who succeeded Antiochus III, begins to try and collect money to pay these taxes to Rome that he owes. During this period, there are religious developments. There is the rise of attention to apocalyptic literature. There's much more apocalyptic kinds of materials being produced within Judaism, most of which you don't see in in the Old Testament, but that appear in what is now a collection known as the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. There's an emphasis on the soul and the afterlife that is developing during this period. There's a lot of speculation about the relationship between God and evil. Theodicy is emerging during this period. Discussion of angels and wisdom literature is developing. There are 2 key pieces of wisdom literature that appear in the Apocrypha that are written during this time. Sirach, and wisdom. So the question is becoming, how does God's treatment fit in with justice, law, and promise in the midst of the chaos that is emerging around Israel before we even get to the Maccabean War, much less in the Maccabean War? Now, the backdrop that feeds Antiochus Epiphanes that led into the Maccabean War, and this is the last slide I want to go back and kind of catch up on, is also the product of this intrigue. The Jewish high priest Onias III, so we've moved down the ladder one priest here, is pro-Egypt and pro-law and protected Hyrcanus Tobiah's monies at the temple. This is discussed in 2 Maccabees 3. While Simon Tobiah, okay, a relative, all right, was pro-Seleucid. So I wonder what their dinners were like, okay, when the family got together to discuss politics. Okay, they are disagreeing with one another about how things are falling out. Seleucid rule goes to Seleucid IV in 187 to 75. He precedes Antiochus IV. And then to his brother Antiochus, who rules from 175 to 164, and not to his sons. Now, Onias III was opposed, the priest, and politically outmaneuvered by his brother Joshua, also known as Jason, who was pro-Syrian. When Antiochus IV comes to the throne in 175, Jason agitates against Onias III and purchased the priesthood from Antiochus Epiphanes IV and seeks to Hellenize Israel in 175 and 174. The point here is that the priesthood is becoming secularized and is now going to the highest bidder. It's becoming an issue of raw politics. Negative reaction by Torah loyalists creates the Hasidim. The Hasidim are the ancestors to both the Pharisees and the Essenes, and they are anti-Hellenist. So as the priests get closer and more closely tied to the politics, as they begin to buy and sell the priesthood, there is a reaction among the religious faithful against what's going on. And this actually serves as part of the backdrop beyond the sacrificial and edict issues of Antiochus Epiphanes IV that feeds into the movement towards the Maccabean War. And I didn't think I made that clear last time, and so I wanted to be sure that I clarified that. Antiochus IV conquers Egypt except for Alexandria. He plunders Jerusalem on his return. In return to Egypt, he is checked and weakened by Rome, a key to understanding his later actions. He's stopped in Egypt by Gaius Popilius Lanus, who gives the famous circle ultimatum. He corners Antiochus. He basically captures him. He draws a circle around him with his sword and basically says, you can have your life as soon as, you can spare your life as soon as you agree to submit to Rome. And don't step out of that circle until you make that decision. Okay, it's kind of what is known as rhetorical persuasion. Okay? And so he eventually agrees to this, and this only furthers and deepens Antiochus Epiphanes' need to be able to satisfy Rome. This happens in 168 BC. This is the year before the start of the Maccabean War. So all of that is important background to the Maccabean War, and I just didn't think I made it clear enough last time, so I wanted to be sure that that was made clear. Now, we're going to jump ahead. This is terrible pedagogy, but we're going to do it. Just jump ahead with me now, and we're going to come to the period in which we are approaching Rome's arrival in Jerusalem. So we've gone through the Maccabean War. We've gone through the shock that Antiochus Epiphanes has created. The Maccabees are established in the land. They are beginning to rule. The hope that initially came with them is slowly waning as the Maccabean exercise of power is little different from the way in which Gentile kings had ruled over Israel. And that ends up being a huge disappointment to the hopes that perhaps now things were going to be put together. Remember that what made the Hasmonean rule controversial was the combining of the priesthood with the kingship into one office, something that was very much against the alignment of the Torah and the early history of Israel, in which you had a king who had political responsibility and the priesthood who had religious responsibility for the health of the country. This was done on arrangement temporarily as thanks to the Hasmoneans for the victory of the Maccabean War. And the Essenes didn't like this situation, and so they decided to take their home in the desert at Qumran and the Dead Sea Scroll finds that were discovered just slightly over 60 years ago. So famous and so reorienting to the study of the New Testament. We'll talk about that story later. But really, the discovery of these texts really put Jesus in his first century context more clearly for us and made us see kind of what the landscape was in the first century and helped us to understand a lot of what's going on in the New Testament a lot better in terms of customs and that kind of thing, because we found texts in caves like the one over here off to the left, well, to the left on the slide. Okay, this is where we pick up the story last time. John Hyrcanus, the first of the rulers who came in after Israel's position as an independent nation had been solidly established, finally established, permanently established after 128 during the time of Antiochus VII. Hyrcanus comes on the scene and he conquers Samaria, Idumea, which is the home of Antipater and Herod's, and he used mercenaries as an expansionist king, impure armies, which left the religious faithful unhappy, and continues to tax the people. And this golden age hope, on the one hand, it begins with its expansion and the desire to create a land of a scope like in the period of Solomon, but it also begins to collapse as the factions within Israel just kind of divide out naturally in reaction to what's going on. Hyrcanus establishes an alliance with Rome. One of the things that the Hasmoneans did is they were politically savvy. They knew that if they really wanted to have power, Rome had to have their back. And that's what they undertook to arrange. At this point, opponents arise, including the Pharisees. There is a feast incident involving Hyrcanus in which he basically, very generously as a ruler, says, "Tell me what you want or tell me what I need to do." And one of the priests gets up and says, you need to go back to the old arrangement of the priest being one thing and the king being another, and let someone else be the priest, just be the king, because we hear that your mother, that basically you came from a Roman soldier, okay, which he didn't want to hear. And tact was not exactly Eleazar's top trait. And this helped to produce a split between the Pharisees and the Hasmoneans. The complaint was that the rule was not based on Torah. Now, this relationship with the Pharisees will be renewed later when the Hasmonean ruler turns to his wife and says, "You really need to reestablish a good relationship with the Pharisees," simply for political reasons. The supporters of the Hasmoneans are the Sadducees, the nobility, the aristocracy, who support the status quo and are comfortable with this kind of shared arrangement. There's imposed Jewish rule on others in Palestine. It's the Seleucids in reverse. And the kingship, as we said, is like that of the pagan rulers. Now, here's what Josephus has to say about Hyrcanus. But when Hyrcanus had put an end to this sedition, after that lived happily, he administered the government in the best manner for 31 years and then died, leaving behind him 5 sons. He was esteemed by God worthy of the three privileges: the government of his nation, the dignity of the high priesthood, and prophecy, for God was with him. By the way, that phrase, God being with someone, which you also see in the Old Testament, and you see in the New Testament, you also see in this intermittent literature, this intertestamental literature. It enabled him to know futurities, and to foretell this in particular, that as to his 2 eldest sons, he foretold they would not long continue in government of public affairs, whose unhappy catastrophe will be worth our description, that we may thence learn how very much they were inferior to their father's happiness. Now here's the story of the Pharisees and Hasmoneans' break, which I alluded to with regard to Eleazar. Here it is. However, this prosperous state of affairs moved the Jews to envy Hyrcanus, but they that were the worst opposed to him were the Pharisees, who were already one of the sects of the Jews, as we have informed you already. These have so great a power over the multitude that when they say anything against the king or against the high priest, they are presently believed. That shows you the respect that the Pharisees had decades before we get to Jesus. We're more than a century before the time of Jesus. Now, Hyrcanus was a disciple of theirs and greatly beloved by them. And when he once invited them to a feast and entertained them very kindly, when he saw them in good humor, he began to say to them that they knew he was desirous to be a righteous man and to do all things whereby he might please God, which was the profession of the Pharisees also. You can see where this is going. Okay, I want to be righteous. Tell me what I need to do. However, he desired that if they observed him offending at any point and going out of the right way, they would call him back and correct him. On which occasion they attested to his being entirely virtuous, with which commendation he was well pleased. But still there was one of their guests there, whose name was Eleazar, a man of an ill temper, Josephus doesn't like him, and delighting in seditious practices. This man said, since you desire to know the truth, if you will be righteous and earnest, lay down the high priesthood and content yourself with the civil government of the people. And when he desired to know for what cause he ought to lay down the high priesthood, the others replied, we have heard it from old men that your mother had been captive under the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. He doesn't say it right straight out. It's more indirect. But the point here is implied that you're of mixed lineage, including pagan lineage. The story was false, and Hyrcanus was provoked against him, and all the Pharisees had a very great indignation against him. Now there was one Jonathan, a very great friend of Hyrcanus, but of the sect of the Sadducees, whose notions are quite contrary to those of the Pharisees. He told Hyrcanus that Eleazar had cast such a reproach on him, according to the common sentiments of all the Pharisees, and that this would be made manifest if he would but ask the question, what punishment they thought this man deserved. For that he might depend on it that the reproach was now laid on him with their approbation, if they were for punishing him as the crime deserved. So the Pharisees made answer that he deserved stripes and bonds, but that it did not seem right to punish the reproaches with death. And indeed the Pharisees, even upon other occasions, are not apt to be severe in punishments. Interesting thought in light of what comes later with the Sadducees and the Pharisees in relationship to Jesus. At the gentle sentence, Hyrcanus was very angry and thought that this man reproached him by their approbation. It was this Jonathan who chiefly irritated him and influenced him so far that he made him leave the party of the Pharisees, abolish the decrees they had imposed on the people, and punish those who observed them. From the source arose that hatred which he and his sons met afterward from the multitude. But of these matters we shall speak hereafter. What I would now explain is this, that the Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the law of Moses. And for that reason it is that the Sadducees reject them, and say that we are to esteem those observances to be obligatory, which are in the written word, but are not to observe what are derived from the tradition of our forefathers. And you begin to see the explanation of the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, both politically and religiously. And concerning these things, it is that great disputes and differences have arisen among them, while the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich, and if not the populace, obsequious to them. There's a word I don't use every day. But the Pharisees have the multitude of their side. But about these two sects and that of the Essenes, I have treated accurately in the second book of Jewish Affairs, which we call the War. So that's the description of the break that took place between Hyrcanus and the Pharisees. Hyrcanus dies. Aristobulus the first rules only for 1 year because he dies suddenly after he takes Galilee. Of course, Galilee is the key region in which Jesus ministers. And Alexander Jannaeus comes to power. He's the third son. He's a thorough imperialist. The Hasmonean golden era begins to arrive. The kingdom is equal in size to Solomon's upon Jannaeus' accession to the throne. He's strictly secularist. He has no religious sensitivities whatsoever. He's ruthless in power. He is a raw power king, period. There's civil war during this period. In the year 94, you can see how long Junius ruled, from 103 to 76. There's an incident involving 6,000 dying in the midst of this civil war that makes it's significant enough that Josephus writes about it. There are 800 rebel leaders who are killed during this period. Perhaps they are Pharisees. We don't know that for sure, but that's what we think. And there are 50,000 who die over 6 years during this period. And remember that the population in this area is about probably around 2 million total, if that. So it's a large portion of the entire population. Now, towards the end of his life, with the Pharisees as fierce opponents to the Hasmoneans, Alexander Junius gives his wife, Alexandra, advice as he's dying. And this is Alexander Junius's deathbed wish, communicated to his wife, who is going to become queen. But when his queen saw that he was ready to die and had no longer any hopes of surviving, she came to him weeping and lamenting and bewailing herself and her sons on the desolate condition they should be left in, and said to him, "To whom do you thus leave me and my children, who are destitute of all other supports? And this when you know how much ill will your nation bears you?" But he gave her the following advice, that she need but follow what he would suggest to her in order to retain the kingdom securely with her children, that she should conceal his death from the soldiers till she should have taken that place. After this, she should go in triumph as upon a victory to Jerusalem. That's with a procession. By the way, that procession, that triumphal entry, is part of the background of what happens when leaders claim cities. And it's a foil for the background of Jesus' triumphal entry over a century later. And put some of her authority into the hands of the Pharisees. For that they would commend her for the honor she had done them, and would reconcile the nation to her, for he told her that they had great authority among the Jews, both to do hurt to such they hated, and to bring advantages to whom they were friendly disposed. For that they then believed, best of all by the multitude, when they speak any severe things against others, though it be only out of envy at them. And he said that it was by their means that he had incurred the displeasure of the nation, whom indeed he had injured. So he's basically saying, you have a chance to turn a fresh leaf when you come into rule. And when you turn that fresh leaf, be sure you turn to the Pharisees, because they can make life either easy or difficult for you. Do this, therefore, said he, when you come to Jerusalem, sending for the leading men among them, and show them my body. And with great appearance of sincerity, give them leave to use it as they themselves please, whether they will dishonor the dead body by refusing it burial, as having severely suffered by my means, or whether in their anger they will offer any other injury to that body. Promise them also that you will do nothing without them in the affairs of the kingdom. If you do but say this to them, I shall have the honor of a more glorious funeral from them than you could have made for me. And when it is in their power to abuse my dead body, they will do it no injury at all, and you will rule in safety. So when he had given his wife this advice, he died after he had reigned 27 years and lived 50 years within one. And that's the end of Alexander Junius, who passes on to his wife Alexandra the advice of cooperate with the Pharisees, and you'll have their help along with the Sadducees, and you'll be in good shape. So Alexandra, Salome, it does rule for a period of about 9 years. She is Aristobulus' widow. She is Aristobulus' half-brother's wife by levirate marriage. She is Israel's only queen in the intertestamental period. Her eldest son, Hyrcanus II, becomes high priest because there's one thing she can't be, that's a high priest. And she does work out this agreement with the Pharisees, who gain a political voice, and it works. There's peace with the Pharisees, and she is able to reestablish the Hasmonean rule and authority. Their place in the Sanhedrin leads to rivalry when she dies. And this sets up the arrival of Rome. In fact, what it sets up is a battle between two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II in the period between 67 and 63 BC, the culmination of which is the, listen to this, invitation to the Romans to come into Jerusalem. They're invited in. Help us. Things are too chaotic. Aristobulus II, who is the more ruthless of the two brothers, drives Hyrcanus out, the second out, who is the rightful heir, but the weaker character, from Jerusalem. Hyrcanus II gets Nabatean and Idumean help from Antipater. We're now into the family of Herod the Great with Antipater, to help besiege Jerusalem. Both sides appeal to Rome and to Pompey for help. Pompey had just defeated the Seleucids in Syria. Okay, so you can see how this dance works. Rome is over Syria. When Syria departs from the scene, Rome is now over the entire area directly as opposed to indirectly before with their influence over the Syrians. Here is a picture, a rendition, and I think I can lower these lights a little bit, so I'm going to do that. Here is a rendition of what Second Temple Jerusalem looked like. You can see the temple area here in the middle. You can see that the city is surrounded by multiple walls. At least, if you're going to get to the temple, you've got to get over at least 2 walls, plus the Temple Mount, plus ascend the Temple Mount. So defensively, the temple is in a pretty well-defended position for the most part. Now, Pompey is invited into Jerusalem. He engages in a siege. He works out an agreement initially to come into the city, but then some of the soldiers in the city react to the agreement and don't let him in, and so he just sits there until he finally decides to come in. And this is portrayed for us in Josephus' Antiquities, Book 14. Now, when Pompey had pitched his camp at Jericho, Jericho is down the road just about 20 miles away from Jerusalem, where the palm trees grow. It's right on the edge of the northern edge of just across from the northern edge of the Dead Sea, where the palm trees grow, and that balsam, which is an ointment from all the most precious, which upon any incision made in the wood with a sharp stone distills out from there like juice. He marched in the morning to Jerusalem. Then Aristobulus repented of what he was doing and came to Pompey and promised to give him money. There's always money and dealings involved in this. And receive him into Jerusalem, and desired that he would leave off the war and do what he pleased peaceably. So Pompey, upon his entreaty, forgave him and sent Gabinius and the soldiers with him to receive the money and the city. I mean, you're a general and someone says, hey, I'll hand you the city. Here's some money. You don't even have to fight to take it. As they say, what a deal. Yet was no part of this performed. But Gabinius came back, being both excluded out of the city and receiving none of the money promised. Now imagine, you're told you can take the city. We're going to give you money. You get there to take the city and to get the money. You're told, get out of the city. You're getting no money. You're not happy. Okay? This is not rocket science. Because Aristobulus' soldiers would not permit the agreements to be executed. At this, Pompey was, to use a German phrase, nicht froh, which means not happy. He was very angry, and put Aristobulus into prison, and came himself to the city, which was strong on every side, excepting the north, which was not so well fortified. For there was a broad and deep ditch that encompassed the city, and included within it the temple, which itself was encompassed about with a very strong stone wall. Showed you that picture earlier. Now when there was sedition of the men that were within the city, who did not agree what was to be done in their present circumstances, while some thought it best to deliver up the city to Pompey, what this is communicating to you is, there's chaos in Jerusalem. Some people want to invite the Romans in, and some people don't want them in at all. But Aristobulus' party exhorted them to shut the gates because he was kept in prison. Now these prevented the others and seized upon the temple and cut off the bridge which reached from it to the city, and prepared themselves to abide or to sit or to remain in a siege. But the others admitted Pompey's army in and delivered up both the city and the king's palace to him. So Pompey sent his lieutenant Piso with an army and placed garrisons both in the city and in the palace to secure them, and fortified the houses that joined to the temple and all those which were more distant and without it. And so Pompey literally is escorted into Jerusalem by certain Jews who are tired of the Hasmonean rule. Now, Pompey has heard about the temple, and so he wants to go see it. Of the Jews there fell 12,000, but of the Romans very few. Absalom, who is at once both uncle and father-in-law to Aristobulus, was taken captive, and no small enormities were committed about the temple itself, which in former ages had been inaccessible and seen by none. For Pompey went into it, and not a few of those that were with him also, and saw all that which is unlawful for any other men to see, but only for the high priest. Now imagine you're Jewish, and this happens. Not only are you overtaken by foreign rulers, not only does that indicate evidence of unfaithfulness, but the very holy place itself is defiled by the presence of a pagan ruler, and nothing happens. There's no judgment or anything. Nothing happens. Not a few of those who were with him also saw all which was unlawful for any other men to see, but only for the high priest. There were in that temple the golden table, the holy candlestick, the pouring vessels, a great quantity of spices, and besides these were among the treasures 2,000 talents of sacred money. Cha-ching. Okay? There is money everywhere in this story. Yet did Pompey touch nothing of all this on account of his regard to religion, and in this point also he acted in a manner that was worthy of his virtue. Now that's interesting. He went in, he looked, he didn't do anything, he didn't ransack it, he left it alone, and even though his act was viewed as an act of sacrilege, there was a recognition that he didn't do everything he could have done and what a normal ruler would do. Now we move to the Roman rule proper. Aristobulus II's resistance in refusing tribute, and after 3 months, the city fell. Hyrcanus II invites the Romans and Pompey in 63. The Romans take control over Judea, Galilee, Perea, Idumea. Pompey goes in and defiles the temple, but he doesn't defile it as badly as he could. He asks for heavy tribute. Hyrcanus II is appointed high priest. He will remain high priest until the year 40 BC, until Herod the Great is made the ruler by Rome, and then Herod goes about the business of securing that rule. That takes him to 37 BC. Now the effects of all this are that Jewish cultural identity is struggling to maintain itself in its interaction with Hellenism. The Gentiles are consistently putting pressure on the Jews to be different. Political pressure, social pressure, etc. There is an aristocracy that involves the Sadducees and the Hasmoneans, and they largely are against the Pharisees, although they do allow the Pharisees in to try and create some stability before finally things collapse. There is foreign presence. With it, there is the presence of tribute and taxes, and that leads to resentment. And there is the longing for a true deliverance. The book written after Pompey takes Rome, that is among the more famous of the intertestamental pieces of literature, is a book called the Psalms of Solomon. In the Psalms of Solomon, there is expressed an unrestrained hope for a military deliverer to bring Israel out of this chaos. This figure you and I know as the Messiah. Here's a portion of the Psalms of Solomon, chapters 17 and 18, which, this is a section from chapter 17, which depicts this hope. Behold, O Lord, raise up unto them their king, the son of David, at the time in which you see, O God, that he may reign over Israel your servant, and gird him with strength, that he may shatter unrighteous rulers, and that he may purge Jerusalem from nations that trample her down to destruction. Wisely, righteously, he shall thrust out the sinners from the inheritance. He shall destroy the pride of the sinner as a potter's vessel. With a rod of iron he shall break in pieces all their substance. He shall destroy the godless nations with the word of his mouth. At his rebuke nations shall flee before him. He shall reprove sinners for the thoughts of their heart. And with that declaration from the Psalms of Solomon, Pompey and Rome established their footprint in Israel. But Israel, the pious in Israel, never give up the hope that one day God will deliver them and give them a righteous ruler, because the Hasmoneans have failed in this regard. Okay, what brings the family of Herod into the scene? That's what we're going to look at now. How did Herod the Great come onto the scene? There is tension in Israel until 37, from 63, which is where we are, to 37. Hyrcanus II and Antipater II, who's an Idumean, share rule in Judea. One of the ways that the Romans kind of kept control is they could split the rule among local rulers, not giving anyone too much power, and that way they kept control. Hyrcanus II is called an ethnarch. Antipater II is called a procurator and has responsibility for collecting the taxes. Rome controls through this division of authority, and in 43, Antipater is poisoned. His son Herod, that's Herod the Great, and Phasael become tetrarchs. Both families support Caesar and gain the above appointments. The Hasmoneans have been limited in their authority and have been divided in terms of the kind of rule they are permitted to exercise. Antigonus, a Hasmonean and Aristobulus II's son, defeats Hyrcanus in 40, cuts off his ear. Why do you do that? That disqualifies him for the priesthood. And Phasael, Herod's brother, is killed. Antipater, or Herod, Antipater's son, flees to Rome, gets family protection at Masada, is appointed king of Judea by Rome, but doesn't take control until 37. Because of the chaos, it takes 3 years for the Roman appointment to establish itself. That tells you how chaotic things are. There's political chaos, but religious freedom. The high priest and the Sanhedrin are controlling the religious issues in Israel. Now, during this time, Rome also is under chaos to a certain degree. Octavius and Mark Antony are sharing rule until Octavius, and Octavius is Augustus. Augustus is the figure of the first century in history. He is the most powerful emperor since Alexander. He will almost equal Alexander in the land that he has authority over, and he is a ruthless, shrewd, and brilliant administrator who actually pulls the Roman Empire together and lays the foundation for the solidity of the Roman Empire by his rule. From a political standpoint, in terms of savvy, you cannot say too much about Augustus. Octavius equals the name Augustus Caesar. He rules from 27 to AD 14, which makes him the emperor in power when Jesus is born. Rome consolidates its power first under Antony and Augustus, and then ultimately Augustus defeats Mark Antony as Mark Antony becomes an ally with another figure whose name I'm sure you've heard, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. This is where Cleopatra fits in. Mark Antony and Cleopatra are defeated at Actium in 31 BC. In a naval battle, they survive, but their army is decimated, and they flee to Egypt, where they are run down and once cornered, they commit suicide. This ends what's called the second triumvirate. The first triumvirate was the shared rule between Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Crassus earlier. It ends the period of Roman civil war and the Republic dating back to 133 BC, and now the emperors rule directly. So rule was shared in Rome up to this point. Octavian, Julius Caesar's nephew, is the one who is victorious, and he becomes a monarch, Augustus Caesar, in 27 BC. I'm going to show you a clip in a second that's going to talk about what led people to acclaim that Augustus should be the singular ruler of Rome. He rules until AD 14. He establishes the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, which allows aqueducts and road systems and everything else to be built, censuses to be taken, the empire to be organized, so it becomes a social and political behemoth in political terms. There's a new international stability, and it's at this point that Jesus is born and Christianity emerges. Now, here is probably one of the most famous pieces of sculpture involving Augustus. This is in Rome today. You can go see it at one of the museums in Rome, and this is Augustus dressed basically as a religious priest, a Roman priest. Pontificus Maximus. He is the chief pontiff. If that terminology sounds familiar, okay, it is because when Rome fell and the church became the power in Italy, all those titles went to the Pope. Here's the mausoleum of Augustus, located in the heart of Rome. Across the street from that mausoleum is a shrine to the Pax Romana, including a written out copy of the Res Gestae of Augustus. Augustus, before he died, wrote a chronicle of all that he accomplished for Rome. It was like a short autobiographical summary of his achievements. Okay, and that summary is etched onto a wall in Italy, in Rome, along with a shrine that was erected in honor of the Pax Romana. It's called the Peace Pavilion of Augustus. Now, it's been built around today to protect it, so the ceiling part of this is new, but the old part of it is old. That makes sense, doesn't it? The old part of it is old. Okay? The part of it on the ground. So Herod the Great comes to Palestine, to Israel. He recaptures Jerusalem in 37 BC. He beheads the last opposing Hasmonean, Antigonus, in 37. And he becomes a client king who is indebted to Rome for his power. Now, Herod had a problem at one point. When Mark Antony was fighting Augustus, Herod had made the judgment to support Mark Antony, which, when Mark Antony lost, produced a problem for Herod. Because it's not a good thing to support the loser in a two-way Roman battle. Because if you support the one who loses, you become a loser. Okay? And you can lose more than losing. Okay? You can lose bodily parts. Okay? Like heads. Okay? So it's not recommended to support a loser in a Roman battle. So after Octavian has defeated Mark Antony at Actium in 31, Josephus recounts a meeting that took place between Herod and Octavius, in which Herod has got a major problem. because he's meeting with the guy he opposed who now has the power. He spoke so to Caesar that he had the greatest friendship for Antony and did everything he could that he might attain the government, and that he was not indeed in the army with him because the Arabians had diverted him, but that he had sent him both money and corn, which was but too little in comparison to what he ought to have done for him. For if a man owes himself to be another's friend and knows him to be a benefactor, benefactor is a key term in the culture, patron kings, patrons are called benefactors by those who serve them. Knows him to be a benefactor, he's obliged to hazard everything and to use every faculty of his soul, every member of his body, all the wealth he has for him in which I confess I have been too deficient. So he's sitting here and he begins by saying, I wasn't a good enough friend to Mark Antony to help defeat you. However, I am conscious to myself that so far I have done right, and I have not deserted him upon his defeat at Actium. I am a loyal friend. Nor upon the evident change of his fortune have I transferred my hopes from him to another, but have preserved myself, though not as a valuable fellow soldier, but certainly as a fellow counselor to Antony, when I demonstrated to him that the only way he had to save himself and not lose all his authority was to slay Cleopatra. And now he's turning. And he's saying, I gave him advice. And the advice was that he should get rid of Cleopatra. Now you need to understand that Cleopatra, as an Egyptian queen, was incredibly unpopular in Rome. One of the ways that Augustus got negative opinion on Mark Antony was to portray him as a defector to Egypt because of his relationship with the Egyptian queen. For when she was once dead, there would be room for him to retain his authority rather than to bring you to make a composition with him than to continue at enmity any longer. You could work out an agreement. None of which advices would he attend to, but he preferred his own rash resolutions before them, which have happened unprofitably for him, but profitably for you. Now, therefore, in case you determine about me and my alacrity in serving Antony, according to your anger at him, I know there is no room for me to deny what I have done. Nor will I be ashamed to acknowledge, and that publicly too, that I had a great kindness for him. But if you will put him out of the case and only examine how I behave myself to my benefactors in general, and what sort of friend I am, you will find by experience we shall do and be the same to you. For it is but changing the names, and the firmness of the friendship that we shall bear to you will not be disapproved by you. Brilliant. Nothing short of brilliant. He walks in and he says, I supported Mark Antony. There's no way I can deny it. I was the best friend I could be. I even gave him advice that he didn't take that was in his best interests. And I promise you, I will be as much a friend to you as I was to him. And Herod the Great's power is preserved through that action. It's a pretty interesting period of political intrigue in terms of what's going on. Under Herod the Great, he had 10 wives and 7 sons. Succession becomes a problem as he alters his will 6 times. There is heavy taxation and there is honoring of Rome, including the raising of eagle standards in certain parts of the country, which becomes close to being the rising up of an image. Very controversial whenever it happened during the Roman Empire in Israel. There are 3 key sons. This is the modern version of my 3 sons. There is Archelaus, who rules in Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. There is Herod Antipas, who becomes Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, and is the one who hears the case of Jesus down the road when Pilate sends him to Herod to get local expertise on what's going on. And then Philip, who is Tetrarch, who has the area north and east of the Sea of Galilee. The effects of Augustus's presence is there is some peace and prosperity aside from some of the chaos that's going on at the top. Augustus has established peace in the Roman Empire, and Israel is a beneficiary for the most part of that peace, except for some political intrigue among the upper echelons. The country is fortified, and there is more Hellenization. There is loyalty to temple worship, but little else in terms of religious development. And the foreign associations have left the nation untrusting and uneasy and looking for a deliverer, as the Psalms of Solomon attests. It is here that Christ's birth fits in to our equation. And it is here that we are introduced again to the key figure of Augustus. I have a clip I want to play for you. This comes from another PBS series, not the same one I showed last time. That PBS series is on the Roman Empire, not the Empire of Israel. And this is the portrait of what Augustus did for Rome and the way he was thanked by the people for having done so.
Augustus not only changed the empire, he expanded it. Egypt had been added early in his career. Soon, northern Spain was joined. Augustus drove across Europe into Germany, and he united East and West by adding modern Hungary, Austria, the Balkans, and central Turkey. These victories employed Roman soldiers and senators and offered welcome distractions to the city's poor. When Augustus wasn't staging chariot races or gladiator shows, he displayed exotic animals, the quarry of Rome's far-flung empire. A rhinoceros appeared in the arena, Asian tigers in the theater, a giant serpent in the forum.
One key constituency for Augustus was the plebeian population as well, and that is basically the city mob. You have several 100,000 folks here who have no jobs, and to put it very simply, who need to be kept off the streets and be kept from making trouble, because it's a very volatile and combustible mix there.
The volatile mix that made up Rome stayed quiet for the first 4 years of Augustus's rule. Then, in 23 BC, events took a critical turn. Cassius Dio writes that a series of disasters convinced the people that Augustus needed not less power, but more.
The city was flooded by the overflowing river, and many things were struck by lightning. Then a plague passed through Italy, and no one could work the land. The Romans thought these misfortunes were caused because Augustus had relinquished his office. They wished to appoint him dictator. A mob barricaded the Senate inside its building and, threatening to burn them alive, forced the Senate to vote Augustus absolute ruler.
The demands threatened to unsettle the emperor's precarious political balance. Augustus fell to his knees before the rioters. He tore his toga and beat his chest. He promised the mob that he would personally take control of the grain supply, but Augustus refused to be called a dictator. The crowd disbanded, but the lesson was clear. Augustus was riding a tiger. To keep order on the frontiers, the streets, and the Senate was a superhuman task, and superhuman skills were needed. Luckily for Rome, Augustus had them.
Then something very fortuitous happens. Halley's Comet shows up. And the word is given out by Augustus. This is the soul of Julius Caesar ascending into heaven. So from this point on, he is called Julius Caesar the Divine. Politically, it became very potent, because what does Augustus do at this point? On all his coinage, on all his writings, and all his symbols, whatever, he puts out the words DF, Son of the Divine. And it's really quite an asset in politics to be the son of the divine. There are modern politicians, I think, would be very jealous of being able to do that.
Augustus enhanced his pious new identity with stories of his lean habits. It was said that he lived in a modest house and slept on a low bed, that he ate common foods, coarse bread, common cheese, and sometimes even less.
My dear Tiberius, not even a Jew observes a fast as diligently on the Sabbath as I have today. I ate nothing until the early hours of evening, when I nibbled 2 bites before my rub-down.
Moral change, Augustus began to argue, was the enemy of Rome. He believed that its future ran through its past, through the restoration of values he thought had first made Rome great.
I renewed many traditions which were fading in our age. I restored 82 temples of the gods, neglecting none that required repair at the time.
In public, Augustus led by example. He sacrificed animals in traditional rituals, and he re-established traditional social rules. New laws assigned theater seats by social rank. Women were confined to the back rows. Adultery was outlawed. Marriage and children encouraged. To many, Roman society had recovered its true course. The son of a god was building an empire for the ages.
Who can find words to adequately describe the advancements of these years? Authority has been returned to the government, majesty to the Senate, and influence to the courts. Protests in the theater have been stopped. Integrity is honored. Depravity is punished.
But amid the applause, there were also cries of protest. The emperor's new traditionalism rankled friends and enemies alike. It even rankled his own daughter, Julia. Long a pawn of family politics, Julia assumed that she was exempt from her father's stringent views. She was wrong. And in the coming years, Augustus, the son of a god, would have to confront Augustus, the father.
That gives you a glimpse of Augustus and the shadow that he casts over the history of Rome. It also helps us to appreciate some of the backdrop of some of the claims associated with Jesus, in the sense that there is discussion about the kind of ruler that exists and the kind of power that he needs to have and have access to in order to be who he is. And what's interesting is the contrast that we get between Augustus, who has all this political power around him and who proclaims himself as the Son of God in Rome, in a capital city of great power, in contrast to Jesus, who is born of a peasant family in an outback location of the Roman Empire, with cosmic signs associated with his birth as well. But his use, rise, and reflection of power will be a very different use of that concept than what's going on in the ancient world. And so all this helps to set the context for what's going on. We have this rising Hellenism. We have this almost unprecedented political power in place as Jesus comes on the scene of the New Testament period. And so we've taken our story of Rome up to the point of Jesus' arrival, and now we're going to start the journey into the New Testament period proper. And I'm going to start that today, and we'll finish it on Thursday. And then next week, we'll be going through the cultural background of all this, how people lived and that kind of thing. So here's where we are. just to review, Herod has had a problem of succession. And there is the establishment of a Roman, Idumean, Jewish patronage, client kingship in the land. Herod the Great is seen by the Romans as the Jewish local ruler because his family is partially Jewish, not completely Jewish. He was never completely accepted by the complete Jews in the area, however, although he did try to live somewhat Jewishly in his rule. Now, here's one of the things that Herod did that was controversial. And again, we're back to Josephus' Antiquities. One of the things that he did was to establish these eagle symbols to indicate the alliance to Rome in the land. There was one Judas, the son of Seraphias, and Matthias, the son of Margalothus. I love these names. I'm glad they didn't win these wars and they became the names that went with us into eternity. Anyway, two of the most eloquent men among the Jews and the most celebrated interpreters of the Jewish laws, and men well beloved by the people because of their education and their youth, for all those that were studious of virtue frequented their lectures every day. These men, when they found that the king's distemper was incurable, excited young men that they would pull down all those works which the king had erected contrary to the law of the fathers, and thereby obtain the rewards which the law will confer on them of such actions of piety, for such actions of piety. For that it was truly on account of Herod's rashness in making such things as the law, as the law had forbidden, the making of these eagle idols, which these pious ones are tearing down, that his other misfortunes and this distemper also, which was so unusual among mankind, and with which he was now afflicted, came upon him. In other words, God had judged him with this illness for doing this. For Herod had caused such things to be made, which were contrary to the law, of which he was accused by Judas and Matthias. For the king had erected over the great gate of the temple a large golden eagle of great value, and had dedicated it to the temple. Now the law forbids those that propose to live according to it to erect images or representations of any living creature. And so here you see this tension, even with the ruler that is associated with Rome and who's supposed to represent Judaism. We get actions that are out of line with the law, and which cause the reaction of some of the pious in Israel. Now, when we come to Herod the Great, we've got to understand that he did several things. He, like Augustus, he tried to be a little Augustus. He tried to rebuild and reestablish the authority of Rome, and he did so through a huge building program and through the collection of taxes necessary to engage in this program. Here's a model of his palace located on the wall's edge in Jerusalem. You can see it's a huge area. Here is a picture of the Herodium. This is actually where Herod is buried. They've just recently found the remains of this on this burial site. This is just outside of Bethlehem. It's also just outside of Tekoa, you know your Old Testament, in Amos. And this is one of the palaces that he built that he would stay at outside the city. This is a picture of Herod's tomb. As I said, it's just been found. Here's a picture of another palace that Herod built, the famous palace at Masada, on the edge of the Dead Sea, which is in the background. Now, I'm a long way away when I take this picture, and you can see that it's up a huge cliff, basically. There's a whole community on the top. There was a three-tiered palace down the one side. You can just see the edges of it on this side of the picture, and it tears down into three parts. There are huge cisterns for catching the rainwater, and storing the rainwater to help sustain the community that is there. At the end of the war in which Rome conquers Jerusalem in AD 70, the last vestiges of Jewish presence run to Masada for refuge, and it isn't until 73, 3 years later, that the Jews are defeated at Masada. But this is one of the palace buildings of Herod's building program. Another place that he built was Caesarea Maritima. This was a port city that he built. This became the home of Pilate. Located on the Mediterranean Sea, he was an architectural genius. He built ports in which concrete was laid in the water, and he figured out a way to lay concrete and have it harden in the water. The reason I show you some of this is that sometimes you get the impression that the ancients are kind of dumb and gullible and stupid. You go walk around and you ask how they're able to build some of these things and put these things together, and you realize that there's more to the ancients than meets the eye. Rulers in the period. We've already talked about Augustus. Augustus is succeeded by Tiberius. Tiberius is the emperor during the time when Jesus is executed. The years of his rule are 14 to 37 AD. He's largely a disengaged ruler over Rome during the period of Jesus' ministry. He allowed Sejanus, a prefect of the Praetorian Guard, and someone with a reputation as an anti-Semite, although that's debated, to have much control in foreign matters. Sejanus is procurator of Judea from 26 to 36, and he aggravates Jews with his own insensitive policies, much like the rising up of the eagle standard that we just saw Herod perform. He mints coins that make it very, very clear that Rome is in control of the land. And we'll talk more specifics about Pilate on Thursday. Caligula follows Tiberius. He demanded to be worshipped as a god during his lifetime, which was a little bit unprecedented. But he was assassinated before the statues that were supposed to help set up that cult could be distributed. In fact, when that command goes out, the general who's in charge of the Syria region, which includes Israel, holds back setting up these statues because he knows the moment he does it, he's got political chaos on his hands in Israel. And fortunately for him, other people decide to take care of the god Caligula and remove him from the scene. And so he is assassinated. This is what Josephus has to say about Pontius Pilate. But now Pilate, the procurator of Judea, removed the army from Caesarea to Jerusalem to take their winter quarters there in order to abolish the Jewish laws. So he introduced Caesar's effigies. These are images of Caesar and symbols that reflect his power and presence, which were upon the ensigns, and brought them into the city. Whereas our law forbids us the very making of images, on which account the former procurators were wont to make their entry into the city with such ensigns as had not these ornaments. But Pilate was the first who brought those images to Jerusalem and set them up there, which was done without knowledge of the people, because it was done at night. But as soon as they knew it, they came in multitudes to Caesarea and interceded with Pilate many days, that he would remove the images, and when he would not grant their request because it would tend to the injury of Caesar, while yet they persevered in their request, on the 6th day he ordered his soldiers to have their weapons privately, while he came and sat upon his judgment seat, which seat was so prepared in the open place of the city. This is the Bema seat, the famous Bema seat of the New Testament. That it was concealed, that the army lay ready to oppress them. And when the Jews petitioned him again, he gave the signal to the soldiers to encompass them around, and threatened that their punishment would be no less than immediate death, unless they would leave off disturbing him and go their ways home. So this is a confrontation. The ensigns are in the city. The Jews are protesting. Pilate wants to stop the protests. He surrounds them. He threatens to kill them. Things are escalating. But they threw themselves on the ground and laid their necks bare, and said they would take their death very willingly, rather than the wisdom of their laws should be transgressed. Upon which Pilate was deeply affected with their firm resolution to keep their laws inviolable, and presently commanded the images to be carried back from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Now that was an incident early on in Pilate's rule that set the tone for his rule as prefect. What is in front of you now is a copy of an inscription which was dug up at Caesarea Philippi that actually refers to Pilate. On the second line, you'll see Pilatus, that refers to Pilate as prefect during the time of Tiberius. Tiberius is in the line above. We go on to Claudius and to Nero, and when we hit Claudius and Nero, we're in the period in which Paul is operating, and Nero is the emperor who Paul sees when he comes to Rome in the book of Acts. And we'll pick up the story here next time. All right, when we left off last time, we had entered into the period in which Tiberius had rotated off the throne, and we had come to Caligula as well, and now we're hitting the point where Claudius is ruling, and we're really in the period of the development of the early church, as well as the beginning of, heading into the period of the beginning of the missionary work of Paul. During that time, one of the emperors present was Claudius. And Claudius ruled for 13 years. He was a capable ruler and administrator, and expanded the rights of the people during his rule. He was probably the most, the most educationally sensitive or absorbing of the rulers, and really was a pretty good emperor, probably the best emperor that Rome had had after Augustus. There was tension between, we think it was between Jews and Christians at this time, and in AD 49, Claudius issued an edict that expelled the Jews from Rome. In 49, Jews meaning Jews and Christians, both, because in the mind of Rome, there was not yet the distinction between Jews and Christians that was in the process of emerging in reality. It's important to remember that in these early decades, the early church saw itself very much as Jewish. They preached Jesus as the Messiah, as the completion of promise, and they went into the synagogues and they proclaimed this message. And in proclaiming this message, the message basically was, if you are a good and faithful Jew who's going to respond in covenant faithfulness to what God has been doing, then you will embrace Jesus as the Messiah of Israel. And in light of that message, then, pressure emerged from within the church, from within the synagogues rather, to exclude those who had a Christian message, and that eventually, institutionally, creates the completely separate structure and organization that we come to know on reflection as the church. Well, this tension had risen to a significant degree in Rome, and Claudius finally decided enough and sent the Jews and Christians in Rome scattering out into the rest of the empire. And Priscilla and Aquila, who we meet in Acts, are traveling on the road, if you will, in part because of this edict that was issued by Claudius. There's political intrigue still in the house of Caesar. Two things dominate Roman politics. One is political intrigue, and the other is raw military and political power. And Claudius ends up being poisoned by his fourth wife, who wanted her son Nero to rule. And she's eventually successful in removing him as an impediment, and Nero comes to rule. Now, Nero is the ruler who we think is ultimately responsible for the death and martyrdom of Peter and Paul. Nero is a very sinister ruler who is constantly having to deal with the pressure that's coming from his mother, who also is trying to exercise a lot of political influence, as her removal of Claudius already indicates. Early in his rule, he was pretty reasonable, but as his rule went on, it got more and more erratic. This is the Caesar of Paul's appeals. Interestingly enough, this Caesar, who's certainly among the more, how I say this, notorious of the emperors, is the emperor who is in place when Paul writes Romans 13, where he urges Christians to be submissive to government because they are the servant of God and they hold the sword, etc. It's important to recognize that that statement is being made not when Augustus or Claudius is ruling and you have a kind of moral element and capable rule going on, but rather when a more notorious emperor is in power, namely Nero. Nero's responsible for the first extended persecution of Christians, which shows up in our extra-biblical materials in a report that Tacitus makes about the Great Fire of Rome. This fire swept through much of the city. Much of the city lived in almost tenement kind of housing, very much in squalor. Writers of the period describe how difficult it is to be an everyday person in Rome living an everyday life. Well, a fire sweeps through Rome, and Nero ends up blaming the Christians. And the first real persecution of Christians by the Roman rule takes place in AD 64. And Tacitus notes that Nero blamed this great fire on the Christians and tells a little bit about what he calls the superstition of the Christians. When a Roman didn't like someone's religion, they called it a superstition. The aftermath of this persecution, probably for Paul in a second trip to Rome, led to their martyrdom. The tradition associated with Peter is that he was crucified, and that when he was sentenced to be crucified, that he asked to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to die the exact same kind of death as his Lord had experienced. And if you go today to the Vatican and you walk through St. Peter's in Rome, at one point you will encounter a painting, a very famous painting, in which Peter is being lifted up onto the cross upside down. His head's on the bottom end of the cross as they're getting ready to push it up and crucify him. There also is a church in Rome called the Church of St. Paul, which is an interesting church for a whole lot of reasons. But in it is the traditional burial site of Paul, which you're allowed to gain access to view. So if you ever get to Rome, St. Peter's certainly and St. Paul's in particular are two spots worth visiting, not to mention the Sistine Chapel, although I will tell you, when you go to see the Sistine Chapel, you'll go through a catacombs of rooms before you ever get there. This is one of those deals where they make you wait in line for 3 or 4 hours. You get into the line, you walk in, and then they take you through 150 rooms that you didn't realize you were interested in seeing, okay, until you get to the Sistine Chapel. So it is a very interesting place to see. But some of those rooms are actually worth it. Some of the more famous paintings of different aspects of Greco-Roman and actually intertestamental history are painted in the various rooms that they take you through. Now, after this persecution, Nero's family squabbles, if you will, eventually led into a traumatic form of his rule and led to civil war in which the line coming from Augustus was extinguished. And the trouble is that when you lose your family line as a dynasty, then all the other families line up to see if they can be king. Eventually, the Flavians won out. This is Vespasian. Now, Vespasian's job before he became emperor was that he was leading the Roman troops through the Mediterranean area, including beginning the campaign in Judea to overcome a Jewish revolt that had broken out in 66. But in 68 and 69, he was recalled to Rome, eventually came to power, and his descendant Titus actually is the general responsible for the overtaking of Rome in AD 70. And you can see that Vespasian ruled for about 10 years, and then Titus had a short, little over 2-year rule. Both were considered very effective rulers. And the Roman Colosseum, which you are very aware of from pictures of Rome and discussions of archaeology. The Colosseum, the beginning of its construction took place during this time of rule. Titus had taken Jerusalem in AD 70 for Vespasian, who went to rule when Nero died, winning out over a series of generals who contended for the role of emperor. After Titus came Domitian. Domitian was another one of these rulers who really craved power. He called himself Lord and God, even though the Senate opposed this in Rome. And this led to him being very paranoid. We've already suggested how, even though you're a ruler of Rome, you have to watch the political intrigue around you. And Domitian always thought that his life was at risk. And so he instituted a reign of terror to try and keep control and keep people at its distance and make sure enemies didn't get too close, that kind of thing. And this included the second period of severe persecution after the period of Nero. Now, these periods of persecution are important because they help to generate writings in the Christian church. The second round of persecution under Domitian is probably responsible for the emergence in part of the book of Revelation and the call to be faithful in the midst of the wicked beast that's in the world, which Rome, of course, helps to represent. In the context of the first set of persecutions, we get the emergence in all likelihood of the first of our Gospels, Mark, in which there's a lot of discussion about how to suffer and walk in the same path that Jesus walked. And we think that the persecution background of the era of Nero is in the background of the creation of that gospel. Okay, now I'm going to take you through a series of pictures to kind of summarize what we've been talking about. The picture in front of you now is the back side of a coin, which was minted to indicate the fact that the Romans had conquered Judea. And so you see the symbolism here of the tree and the two figures, one sad, the other dominating figure, picturing Rome's victory over Judea. This is a representation, it's not outstanding, but it's the best they could do, of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 that is in the Museum of the Citadel, which is the History of Jerusalem Museum in Jerusalem. And this is how they portray in kind of little figures the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple. This is a commemorative arch. Notice Titus's arch, which commemorates the fall of Judea to Rome. And this is located in Rome. It's in the area of the Forum. It's actually between the Forum and the Colosseum. And this is certainly one of the more famous of the arches that still remains in the Forum area. And what's significant is it's almost completely intact. On that arch is the following image, and you can barely see it, unfortunately, but you will see in this image a menorah being carried out, which depicts Rome's entering into and sacking the temple and the submission of Judea as a result of Titus's campaign. Now, what were the effects of Roman rule? Well, one of the effects was that the large part of this period that we're talking about experienced what was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was largely a stable period. It was united politically. There was a legal administrative structure set up. Taxes were collected. There was a provincial structure of rule through prefects and governors. There was freedom, however, for local practice. All the Romans cared about was that there would be a peaceful coexistence with the people over whom they ruled. And as long as the people were peaceable and paying their taxes, the Romans were happy. The smaller imperial provinces were governed by prefects. That's what Pilate was. And they had the responsibility basically to keep the peace, to collect the taxes, to make sure that Caesar's interests were honored in the land in question. And in the case of Judea, the high priest was selected with the approval of the prefect. That's important because during the time when Pilate is prefect, every year he is prefect, Caiaphas is high priest. So Caiaphas and Pilate apparently have a decent working relationship with one another. He isn't going about the business of replacing the high priest. He is annually reappointing him. The Roman structure in Judea was helped by client kings like the Herodian family. The building of the aqueducts and trade routes, the road system, etc., helped to link the empire together and created more trade between the parts of the empire. This opened up the possibility for travel by Christian missionaries to take the gospel to various cities. Judaism had a place, and so often Christianity, as viewed as a part of it in Rome, had a place as an acceptable religion for much of the period, by which is meant, it doesn't mean that the religion was necessarily particularly respected, but it was tolerated, it was permitted. The Romans, generally speaking, saw the Jews as kind of a strange religion. They had a strange diet. They kept a strange calendar. They had only one God. You know, a lot about it was different for the Romans, but it was tolerated. And Christianity was seen as being an expression initially of Judaism, as we mentioned, and so the toleration existed and Christianity coexisted under that umbrella. There is much moral degeneracy in the culture, even though Augustus, for example, tried very hard to establish a moral kind of tone to the society. There's much religious syncretism. The instinct of a Roman when he meets a new religion is simply to incorporate it. It isn't a matter of choosing between. You want to stay in good relationship with as many of the gods as possible, and so you embrace any or all of them. By the way, that instinct is still with us in many sections of the world. This explains the emphasis on morality. The standard of pagan culture, the moral standard of pagan culture, or the lack of a moral standard in pagan culture, helps us to explain the emphasis on morality, the emphasis on exclusive devotion to God, in light of all the choices that are out there, and to Christ that we see in the epistles. And in fact, the choice to become a Christian in the first century would produce a kind of double alienation. If you were Jewish, it was seen as being a move away from faithful Judaism by those in Judaism, and you were socially isolated. And if you were a Gentile, it was seen as a cultural move away from the culture because you were moving from many gods to one God. And you were moving from a kind of oftentimes moral indifference, except perhaps among the more elite, to caring morally about how you lived. So all of this feeds the story of what we see in the New Testament, particularly in the vice and virtue lists that you get in certain portions, or if you think about the descriptions that you get, say, at the end of Romans 1 about the nature of Gentile culture. That complaint, by the way, that Paul makes at the end of Romans 1 is a little different than the way a Jewish person would complain about Gentile culture as well, in its idolatry and the impact of its idolatry. So that's the history of Rome. Now what I want to do is to transition and come back and take a tighter look at what's going on in Judea. And for that, we're going to the next set of slides. Now, when Herod the Great, we've rotated back now to the period of Augustus. When Herod the Great died, yes, Rob?
It seems that in the Gospels, during the execution of Jesus, the Pharisees seem to be appealing to Caiaphas, to the high priest, and that political structure. But then on the other hand, one of their main critiques of Jesus seems to be that he's associating with tax collectors who are complicit with the Romans, etc. So I'm confused as to why they would participate in that structure and how they would really look at the high priest if in fact the high priest is appointed.
You need to remember that the Pharisees are kind of along for the ride, that the Sadducees are in control. Sadducees have embraced what's going on with Rome. The Pharisees would prefer for the Romans not to be present in the land. But they have not opted, like the Essenes have, to go out into the desert and wait for something to happen. They have opted rather to stay engaged, and in staying engaged, to cooperate to the extent possible, but try and encourage the people to be faithful to God on the other hand. So the Pharisees are a little bit in political tension in terms of the way they're relating to the Roman government.
Would they be ambivalent about the high priest?
They would be somewhat ambivalent about the high priest in the sense that they would view the high priest as perhaps being a little too complicit and compromising with reference to Roman presence and Roman rule. Now, the reason they band together with respect to Jesus is because both groups sense that what Jesus is doing represents a challenge to either of their approaches to Judaism. Okay, so they come together on that basis. But the challenge that they take, what they do is they take a religious charge and a religious objection that they have to Jesus because of the nature of his ministry, the way he's challenging the law, the way he's challenging the traditions, that kind of thing. And they turn that into a political charge for Pilate. Pilate would not give one rip about the religious disputes that exist between Jesus, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. If it's a religious dispute, he would say, as long as it isn't disruptive to the public peace, I don't care. You sort it out. But the moment it becomes cast in terms of this person is claiming to be a king, and a king whom you didn't appoint, that's Pilate's business. Okay? All right. Herod the Great has 3 sons. Archelaus is one of them. And Archelaus was given the role of ethnarch. He was not very popular. And in fact, the Jews attempted, before he was appointed ethnarch, according to the will that Herod the Great left, tried to keep him from being appointed as king. And this is one of the reasons he was simply called an ethnarch. It was kind of a demotion to kind of put him on alert. The impression was that he wasn't that he wasn't likely to be a very friendly ruler, and so they were nervous about him having the power. He was very unpopular, but he did have responsibility for Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. This is the king that Joseph fears. And so when Jesus and Mary come back from Egypt after Jesus is born, rather than going into Judea, they move north into Galilee, which puts them outside of Archelaus' rule. The instincts that the Jewish community had about Archelaus were basically correct. And by AD 6, Archelaus is replaced with the suggestion that he go on a permanent vacation in France. Okay? This is the Roman way of banishing someone and taking care of someone. They say, go and live in exile somewhere, and enjoy your bonbons and chocolate. I don't think it was quite that cool. But anyway, and so he's banished to France, and the area becomes a Roman imperial province ruled by a prefect with the capital in Caesarea Maritima. Well, we showed you pictures of that earlier on. But with a strong presence in Jerusalem and the beginning of the formal development of a census, this numbering had probably already begun to take place, but now it was being more seriously implemented. In AD 6, something that was very unpopular with the Jews because it was a reminder of the fact that Rome had power. Meanwhile, to the north and the east of the Sea of Galilee, Herod Philip is in charge. And you can see that his status as a ruler was much more stable. He went from 4 BC to AD 34, right smack into the period of Jesus' crucifixion. And this is a largely Gentile area that includes Caesarea Philippi, where Peter makes his famous confession of Jesus being the Christ. And his death leads to rule being given to Herod Agrippa I. Now, here's a map of ancient Israel. And just to show you kind of where we've been in some of the areas we've been talking about, remember we told you that the Herodian family came out of Idumea. Idumea is located in what is the southern part of Israel today, just to the west of the Dead Sea. Qumran, the Essene community that we've talked about, is right here, kind of 11 o'clock, if you want to think of the Dead Sea as a clock. Okay, about 11 o'clock on the Dead Sea, maybe 11:15. Jerusalem is right here in the middle. Caesarea Philippi is, well, it's not quite on the map. It's to the north of the Sea of Galilee. The Decapolis, the region of 10 Gentile cities, is just to the south of the Sea of Galilee. You can see that Tiberias, Capernaum, and Nazareth are all in the Sea of Galilee area. To the north of all this, on the coast, are Tyre and Sidon. Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea by the sea, is located in the middle of the plain of Sharon, or the valley of Sharon, on the coast. So those are some of the major sites that exist between in the first century. The Perea area is where traditionally John the Baptist is said to have performed his baptisms. Arimathea, you can see, is kind of north and slightly west of Jerusalem. Joseph of Arimathea is from. Modin, which is not on this map, if you drew a line from Jerusalem to Joppa, about right midway on that line would be where Modin is. That's where the Maccabean War started. Let's see. Masada, which is where the Jewish revolt was finally completely quelled as the last Jews were defeated in AD 73, is located at about 9 o'clock on our Dead Sea clock. And that's probably most of the key sites. Herodium, the other Herodian palace, is located right here, just slightly south and east of Bethlehem, which itself is only a few miles south of Jerusalem. There isn't a scale on here, but the size of the country, oh, there it is. The size of the country, Bethlehem is about 4 miles south of Jerusalem. The size of this country is not large. It's about 80 miles wide at its widest, and about 130 miles long. And so everything is very crammed in terms of size and space. This is a picture of Caesarea Philippi. And again, it's a little washed out because of the lighting. I can't mess with the lighting because they're filming this. But anyway, this is a huge cliff that just runs up the side. And here's a grotto area. Everything that you're seeing here became, some of it after the time of Jesus, in fact, a lot of it formally after the time of Jesus, became the location for a variety of pagan temples. The Temple of Augustus in Caesarea Philippi is located over here. It's not in the picture, in the corner. If you turn this corner around this grotto right here, there is a temple to Augustus. There was a temple erected to Augustus that would have been there in the time period, again, when Peter was confessing that Jesus was the Christ. And it's interesting that the confession of Peter takes place in a site that is literally loaded with pagan worship. This was the most, the most concentrated location for pagan worship in the area of the land of Israel. You can't tell this really closely, but that's Mike Buer. Now, we have one son left, Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas also ruled for quite a long period of time, from 4 BC to AD 39. He is the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. So that is the region where Jesus ministered, along with the area of the Jordan Valley that was over here between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. This was Jesus' home territory, and Tiberias was the capital. So we come back to the map. Here's Perea right down here, the Decapolis to the north, the Sea of Galilee, and Tiberias, if you think of the Sea of Galilee as a clock, is located at about 9 o'clock on the clock. And again, you can see many of the locations that you're familiar with. Magdala, which is where the name Magdalene, Mary Magdalene, comes from, is located off the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum at about 11 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee. Bethsaida at about 12:30 on the Sea of Galilee, and Gennesaret off the Sea of Galilee slightly at about 3 o'clock. So you can see that Nain is further off to the south. That's still a real small community today. There's a church on the traditional site of the raising of the widow of Nain's son. And Cana is just to the north, slightly to the north and east of Nazareth, off some from the Sea of Galilee. And you're only, again, the Sea of Galilee is only about 30 or so miles from the coast if you come west. Herod Antipas is responsible for the death of John the Baptist, who complained about the immorality of his marriage to Herodias. Herodias left her first husband in order to marry Herod Antipas in a kind of political wedding. And when John the Baptist complained about this, eventually Herod Antipas slew John the Baptist. By the way, this is something we know not only from the New Testament, but it's also an event that is described by Josephus in Antiquities, Book 18. You get the sense that the book of Antiquities that Josephus wrote is important for our understanding of the history of Judea. You have gotten the right impression. If we did not have Josephus' Antiquities, Book 18, we would know far, far less about what's going on in this period than we do. This is the Herod who is responsible for interrogating Jesus according to Luke 23. Luke is the only one who mentions this part of the interrogation. Pilate initially sends Jesus to Herod because Herod is the Jewish expert in the Roman court, being half Jewish himself. And so Pilate wants to consult with Herod about what's going on here. The history is that Herod and Pilate had a little bit of a rough relationship for a time, and then it smoothed out. And some people think it was Pilate's willingness to consult Herod about this particular incident that may be part of the smoothing out, because that communicated a level of respect for Herod. Herod Antipas also is told to take a long vacation in a faraway place, France, in AD 39. Apparently, France is the, place du jour for failed rulers. And so he's banished to France in AD 39 when his brother-in-law, Herod Agrippa, accuses him of being an unfaithful ruler before Caligula and Caligula's kind of a nervous sort. So Caligula says, go and take a vacation in a long, unreachable place where there is no internet. Here's what Josephus has to say about John the Baptist. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist, for Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commended the Jews to exercise virtue. Let me do some translating for you. Whenever someone was moral in Roman culture, philosophically, that was said to involve discussion of the virtues. Virtues being the good traits, vices being the evil ones. And so virtue was the way to talk about ethics in the Roman world. What we would consider to be walking with God, being moral in our walk with God, the Romans would call virtue. And so Josephus has translated that into language that the Romans would recognize. So he commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, a kind of expression of what we would recognize as kind of the great commandment. Love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. Very similar kind of thing laid out here as Josephus describes the ministry of John the Baptist. And so to come to baptism. For that washing with water would be acceptable to him if they made use of it, not in order to put away or the remission of some sins only, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. Now, one thing that Josephus doesn't mention about John the Baptist is his eschatological call, his call to covenantal faithfulness. And the reason he doesn't do this is because Josephus doesn't like Jewish movements that invoke, how do I say this, God to remove or deal with the Gentile presence in the land. Why isn't he going to write about that to Romans? Okay, yeah, I get that.
Because he's catering the Roman.
Exactly.
He's catering their favor for his survival.
Exactly right. He's catering their favor for his survival. So he blames the zealots, those who sought to do this kind of thing, for the trouble in Rome, and he said not all Jews are like the zealots. So anyone who had a kind of eschatological touch to their ministry, that God was in the process of delivering his people from the pagan Gentiles, that part of what they represent is going to be played down by Josephus in what he writes. And that's the case with John the Baptist. Goes on to say, now when many others came in crowds about him, for they were greatly moved or pleased by hearing his words, Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best by putting him to death, to prevent any mischief he might cause, and to not bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it should be too late. You can see the moral element here in the issue of repentance associated with John. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus. This is one of the palace areas where jails were located in Herod's area. The castle I before mentioned, and was there put to death. Now the Jews had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure against him.